So today's article is a classic of cultural psychology. It's called Insult Aggression in the Southern Culture of Honor and Experimental Ethnography. Three experiments examined how norms characteristic of a culture of honor manifest themselves in the cognitions, emotions, behavior, and physiological reaction of Southern white males. Participants were University of Michigan students who grew up in the North or South. In three experiments, they were insulted by a Confederate who bumped into the participant and called him an asshole. Compared with Northerners, who were relatively unaffected by the insult, Southerners were A, more likely to think their masculine reputation was threatened, B, more upset, as shown by a rise in cortisol level, C, more physiologically primed for aggression, as shown by a rise in testosterone levels, D, more cognitively primed for aggression, and E, more likely to engage in aggressive and dominant behavior. Findings highlight the insult-aggression cycle in cultures of honor, in which insults diminish a man's reputation and he tries to restore his status by aggressive or violent behavior. So, based on this right now, we can see that there's a difference in how Northerners and Southerners respond to being called an asshole. And that difference is massive across so many different categories: self-report, cortisol levels, testosterone, cognitive measures, and aggressive behavior. So this study is one of the best scientific studies, not just because it's looking at an interesting question, but it shows all the measures. It shows everything with it. Let's read about the culture of honor. Approximately 20,000 to 25,000 Americans will die in homicides this year, and tens of thousands more will be injured in stabbings or gunfights that could have ended in death. In about half of the homicides for which police can find a cause, the triggering incident seems to be argument or conflict related, and in many of these cases, this triggering incident might be classified as trivial in origin, arising from a dispute over a small amount of money or an offensive comment or a petty argument. People literally die over small amounts of money, offensive comments, and petty arguments. Such incidents, however, are not trivial to the participants in them, clearly. Rather, the participants behave as if something important is at stake. They act as if they were members of what anthropologists call a culture of honor, in which even small disputes become contests for reputation and social status. The United States is home to several subcultures holding such norms. The research presented here is a first attempt at what might be called an experimental ethnography of one such subculture within the United States, that of the Southern white male. Historical background. For centuries, the American South has been regarded as more violent than the North. Over the years, historians, social scientists, and other observers have developed a number of explanations for this, drawing on such facts about the South as its higher temperature, its poverty, and its history of slavery. There is evidence to support all these explanations, and they have been dealt with more fully elsewhere. We think the best single explanation has to do with the South being home to a version of the culture of honor in which affronts are met with violent retribution. Historians and other observers have often noted that in the South, men have had to take action against insults or else lose status before their family and peers. As Fisher noted, from an early age, small boys were taught to think much of their own honor and to be active in its defense. Honor in this society meant a pride of manhood and masculine courage, physical strength, and warrior virtue. Male children were trained to defend their honor without a moment's hesitation, lashing out against challengers with savage violence, something that's taught. Originally, there were good historic and economic reasons for such norms to take hold in the South. For one, the economy of the South was initially based to a large extent on herding. And cultural anthropologists have observed that herding cultures, the world over, tend to be more approving of certain forms of violence. Herdsmen must be willing to use force to protect themselves and their property when law enforcement is inadequate and when one's wealth can be rustled away, stolen from them. If you're herding sheep and you go to sleep and you come back and all your sheep are gone, right? They were stolen from you. So you have this fragility of wealth in herding cultures. That's very scary to those that are invested. The settlers of the South came primarily from herding economies of the fringes of Britain, where lawlessness, instability, political upheaval, and clan rule had been present for centuries. Not the same clan, different clan, but still same idea. The people from the the border country of Britain were forced to be self-reliant in their pursuit of justice, and they brought with them this tradition as they settled the lawless frontier south, as Fisher wrote. In the absence of any strong sense of order as unity, hierarchy, or social peace, back settlers shared an idea of order as a system of retributive justice. The prevailing principle was lax talionis, the rule of retaliation. It held that a good man must seek to do right in the world, but when wrong was done to him, he must punish the wrongdoer himself by an act of retribution that restored order and justice in the world. If the ethic of self-protection had been adaptive in Britain, the frontier conditions of the South and the vulnerability of Southerners to the theft of their herds and other lawlessness probably reinforced the self-reliant stance. Law enforcement in the frontier South was either inadequate, corrupt, or just too far away. So as a North Carolina proverb put it, every man should be sheriff of his own hearth. Such conditions perpetuated the culture of honor in the South as it became important to establish one's reputation for toughness, even on matters that might seem small or on the surface. If one had been crossed, trifled with, or affronted, retribution had to follow as a warning to the community. Defense of honor can be an important part of defense of self, as Daly and Wilson observed. A seemingly minor affront is not merely a stimulus to action, isolated in time and space. It must be understood within a larger social context of reputations, face, relative social status, and enduring relationships. Men are known by their followers as the sort who can be pushed around or the sort who won't take any shit. Has people whose word means action and people who are full of hot air. Has guys whose girlfriends you can chat up with impunity or guys you don't want to mess with. In the Old South, allowing oneself to be pushed around or affronted without retaliation amounted to admitting that one was an easy mark and could be taken advantage of. As Pitt Rivers noted, whenever the authority of law is questioned or ignored, the code of honor reemerges to allocate the right to precedence and dictate the principles of conduct. So what's going on here is they're saying, like, people didn't have law. They didn't have, police or established institutions. Their honor was the only code that anybody lived by. And people didn't necessarily protect each other. We took advantage of each other. Or we can take advantage of each other. This is the big social dilemma. What's the biggest sort of threat to a human? Another human. And so now when you don't have systems in place that are protecting individuals, what defaults? Well, we're still social beings. We have reputations, we have memories, we have knowledge. And if somebody views you as the kind of person that can be walked over, you're going to be walked over. And I think any of us that survived junior high understand what this is like, or at least anybody that survived a junior high like I did knows what this is like. If you survived a junior high like this, let me know. But yeah, I remember this. We didn't really have lawfulness in my junior high. Nobody snitched. And so, like, if you were the kid that wouldn't do anything, right, or had no one protecting you, you got a basketball thrown at your head every day and nobody did anything to help you out. And if you tattled, you got more basketballs thrown at your head every day. And I've seen this happen. I've had this happen to me. And, it is, I guess for me, this resonates a lot because I grew up in junior high and high school in a place where I feel like this was the case. You couldn't snitch at my high school. That would lead to even worse consequences. And so, you did have to develop this reputation that you couldn't be messed with, that people couldn't just take your stuff. And I remember, like, developing that reputation, right? It wasn't fun. It involved fights and violence and things like that. But at the end of the day, it was better off than ending up in a situation where I was the kid getting picked on all the time, which very easily could have been the case if you see any pictures of me from the 90s. Okay, mullet, bad glasses, like just the whole thing, right? But yeah, looking like that, growing up in Gary, Indiana, didn't really kind of makes you tough. But like this is a reality for me. I've seen this. I've lived this. I know what it's like. So I really understand this quite a bit. But I think these things are true. And after that, I remember when I developed my reputation. It was a couple days after I moved, and like some kid sucker punched me in the gut, and I said, "Is that all you got?" Right? Like those are things that build your reputation that then protect you. So I was able to like coordinate. I'm not very well at that time. I wasn't very good at necessarily defending myself. I mean, I kind of was, but I was tough. So that earned some respect because kids were like, "Oh my God, we're gonna have to beat this kid up like for an hour before he cries." And I'm not saying that as like a point of pride. I'm saying that as a point of understanding the context that led to the culture of honor. We couldn't snitch. The teachers didn't really care if we did snitch. I mean, they would kind of care, but not really. And then the administration would care, but only if you had evidence, right? So it was like really hard to deal with that. But ultimately, if anybody else has lived one of these cultures, which I found started developing in junior high, kind of kept developing through high school, somewhat does existed in college, right? That these are real structures. This is a real sort of classic response, and the anthropology suggests it's a global response that people's reputations are the important thing, are the foundation of a culture of honor, and you are protecting your reputation in a culture of honor. And so I think it's just really important to think about, this is a foundational principle. What happens when larger, big social structures aren't present, right? One has to develop a reputation, and one has to live with that reputation. Though frontier conditions in the South disappeared and the herding economy has become less and less important, culture of honor norms appear to have persisted into this century. Brearley, 1934, for example, argued that in much of the South of his day, it was impossible to convict someone of a murder if A, the killer had been insulted, and B, he warned the victim of his intent to kill if the insult were not retracted or compensated. 1934... We're getting close to the 100-year mark, but it's less than that. It's 86 years ago. 86 years ago, if somebody insulted you, you said I was going to murder you if they didn't take it back, and they said, fuck you. Excuse my language, but we're talking about violence here. You killed them. You would go on trial and be found not guilty in probably less than a week, right? In the South. Nisbet and colleagues recently have shown that violence stemming from culture of honor norms is still part of the Southern legacy today. White male homicide rates of the South are higher than those of the North, and the South exceeds the North only in homicides that are argument or conflict related, not in homicides that are committed while another felony such as robbery or burglary is being performed. Such findings are consistent with a stronger emphasis on honor and protection in the South. Cohen and Nisbet, 1994, came to similar conclusions about a Southern culture of honor in analyzing data from major national surveys. They showed that the South was more approving of particular types of violence and not of others. The South's approval of violence seemed limited to violence used for self-protection, to respond to an insult, or to socialize children. Thus, although Southern white males were not more likely to endorse statements about violence in general, many people only learn through violence, that's a statement that they were asked. They were more willing to endorse violence when it was used to protect. A man has the right to kill to defend his house. or to answer an affront, approving of a man punching a stranger who is drunk and bumped into the man and his wife on the street. Southern white males were also more likely to stigmatize men described in brief scenarios who did not respond with violence, criticizing them for being not much of a man. If they failed to fight, not much of a man, if they failed to fight or shoot the person who challenged or affronted them. Such results suggest that Southern white male approval of violence is produced by culture of honor norms. The culture seems to be perpetuated as well by the institutions of the South. Cohen argued that culture of honor norms are embodied in the laws and social policies of Southern states, as reflected in looser gun control laws, less restrictive self-defense statutes, like we even see this today, and more hawkish voting by federal legislatures on foreign policy issues. So that means more willing to fight because that's a federal government employee, like a senator, is more likely to vote for war. And that's what hawkish means. For example, in two field experiments, Cohen and Nisbet showed that Southern institutions, such as employers and the media, may perpetuate culture of honor norms by being less likely to stigmatize violence in defense of honor and more likely to see it as justifiable or sympathetic. So, to me, this is getting at a little bit of interface, right? We got this media. We're part of this culture. We seek out some entertainment, some knowledge. And we're not just getting knowledge, we're getting interpretation of facts. And that interpretation shapes our worldview for how everything should work, right? So in this case right here, they're saying, oh, you might consume some media from the culture, but this consumption of this thing that you want to consume has a virus with it that attaches in your mind, right? And changes the way you think about killing another person. Literally, if you think about this, why do people turn on the news? It's to just learn what's going on. Very basic human desire to gossip, and to have information about humanity. And when you do that, all of a sudden you're being turned into a person that approves of killing another person for something as minor as an insult to one's wife, girlfriend, partner, self, business, right? If somebody says your business sucks, right? Or that, you're an idiot, right? You're dumb or whatever. You're worthless, right? It now becomes justifiable to act with violence in this culture, and you believe the same way. You're in that culture. You can tell yourself you don't believe in that way, but, next thing you know, you're in the middle of a large fight, right? You're in the middle of defending your own honor. You're worried about not defending your honor because you're worried about the consequences of that happening. And yes, I am speaking from personal experience. It wasn't death, but it was, playground beatings. It was, minor, like stuff like that. Where I came from, some people also had to worry about gang violence. This was a concern of my own, but I stayed out of that. But ultimately, right, if you're not going to protect your honor, somebody else might actually shoot you or beat or hospitalize you with a beating. These are things that did happen where I came from, and are things that I think when I talk to other people, they don't understand. So I'm going to give you, if you've never experienced this, I'm going to give you a little bit of a background. You end up engaging in violence despite not wanting to. But having to. And I think that's really important. And then over time, you view it as normal. But I remember those first times of having to engage in violence. Like, that cortisol response is not fun. That stress, that sweat, that fear, right? I remember being terrified in 6th grade that somebody was going to shoot me, right? And if I didn't respond a certain way, that it would be more likely to happen. I was also terrified that I was going to be the kid that consistently was beat up on the playground, that was de-pantsed in front of people and things like that, and that's not a good place to be in. But ultimately, you're in a group of people, you develop the norms, and as time went on, I viewed violence as less and less and less problematic. I just viewed it as a way to solve things, just like everyone else, right? So I want you to keep that in mind. get into that mindset. You're in a group of people. The adults are okay with it. To some degree, the adults were okay with it. Everybody around you is engaging in it. If you don't engage in it, you end up hurt. So then you start engaging in it. And then you engage in it for 8 years. By the end of those 8 years, or 12 years, I guess, with how long high school is or education is, but, the 8 at the end, then you view it as normal and as normalized and has a method to solve problems, right? And it becomes an automatic response that you can't overcome. And I really am just sharing this with you from my experiences growing up in a culture of honor, right? Yes, technically Indiana isn't the South. Technically Gary's an urban area near Chicago, but it had the mix of the culture of honor processes that, or the social processes that lead culture of honor to exist. And so I really want you to step outside of this, like, there's something wrong with Southern white men, right? And I want you to realize there's something wrong with Southern white male culture. And I don't mean this as a insult. I'm saying, like, violence in this way that we now view socially as inappropriate. And we also got to understand that those of us that view this as inappropriate are coming from a different societal context. But we view this as inappropriate from our context, but place any one of us in one of these situations that I'm describing. If I placed you in my junior high and high school situation, I believe your attitude towards violence would change, and it would take 10, 15 years out of that for even your own behavior to drastically change. But it's there with you. It's there in your thoughts. It's there in your behavior. I'll give you an example of this in my own sort of life. So I'm in grad school. I'm very much removed from growing up in the neighborhood I grew up in. Very much removed from it. And I was playing ultimate frisbee, something you would not do in my neighborhood that you grew up in. Something I didn't even know what it was. But I was playing ultimate frisbee as part of a league, and I remember this guy on the other team was just verbally assaulting me. And I held my cool and I didn't do anything. But for the next 4 days, I regretted not punching the guy in the face. This is the level of culture of honor that exists inside of those of us that have survived it. Sorry, my screen just blanked because I was talking too much. But I really want you to understand, like, this isn't like created by people. I mean, it's further perpetuated by people. But people are just thrown in, at least in my experience, people are just thrown into this situation. They develop around a whole ecosystem of this. And then it's just what becomes of you. I think there's not as much choice in humanity as we like to think. Anyways, I hope that makes it a little bit clearer. I'm going to keep reading. The culture seems to perpetuate by the institutions of the South. Cohen argued that culture of honor norms are embodied in the laws and social policies of Southern states as reflected in looser gun control laws, less restrictive self-defense statutes, and more hawkish voting by federal legislators on foreign policy issues. For example, in 2 field experiments, Cohen and Nisbet showed that Southern institutions, such as employers and the media, may perpetuate culture of honor norms by being less likely to stigmatize violence in defense of honor. Notice the stigmatized part. Right? If you're viewing this as ridiculous, your society stigmatized violence. And more likely to see it as justifiable or sympathetic. If your society doesn't stigmatize the violence, then guess what? You're going to be violent. And I think that's an interesting observation. And you can see this at bigger levels with gender norms. Like, we know that women have the capacity to be as violent as men, but the gender norms stigmatize violence in women. And so what we actually see is not necessarily We do see a reduction in murders and things like that, but we see heightened, when we look at the research on gender and violence, we've seen a heightened relational aggression of social exclusion and things like that. So violence does perpetuate from human being to human being. It's just in what ways are acceptable. And yeah, take social psychology if you want to learn more about that. But I'm just trying to get you in the mindset here for you to see what could happen. Now I'm going to keep going. In the work presented here, we supplement the attitude, homicide rate, law and social policy, and field experimental evidence with experimental evidence from the laboratory, because evidence from the laboratory is superior to evidence everywhere else in showing causality. So they want to show cause. They want to show control. They want to show that these effects actually exist. In these laboratory experiments, we examined whether even college students who are from the South subscribe to culture of honor norms, and we explored how these norms might manifest themselves in the cognitions, emotions, behaviors, and physiological reactions of our participants. The overarching theme of these experiments was the importance of an affront of Southern white males and their need to respond to it. If Southerners subscribe to a culture of honor and Northerners do not, the reactions of Northern and Southern participants to an insult should differ in predictable ways. Compared with Northerners, Southerners should be A, more likely to view an insult as damaging to their status and reputation, B, more upset emotionally and physiologically by the insult, like me 2 days later, right, after the Frisbee insult. Who cares? But I was all riled up about it. I'm going to be honest, a few months after that, I would think about it and still be like riled up, like why didn't I act? And C, more prepared, cognitive, physiologically, and behaviorally for aggressive and dominant behavior after being insulted. The present studies were designed to test these hypotheses. When we refer to Southerners and Northerners, we refer to the particular populations we have studied to date, namely non-Hispanic white males from the North and from the South of the United States. It is these populations for which extensive anthropological and historical literature indicates there are substantial differences with respect to culture of honor norms. When we refer to Northerners and Southerners participating in the experiments described below, we are using this as a shorthand way of referring to the students of the University of Michigan meeting these restricted definitions. Because our sample is limited to students at the University of Michigan, it is also certainly not representative of all white male Northerners and Southerners. The students, both Northern and Southern, come from families that are well off financially. In experiment 1, oh my God, holy crap. In 1996, the median income for Northerners was between $80,000 and $90,000. For Southerners, it was between $90,000 and $100,000. Oh my Lord. The Southerners may be unusual. So keep that in mind. These are rich people. I'm just going to throw it up. 1996, 100 grand in 1996. Go look at an inflation calculator. I think it's like 3 times the amount of that. So it's like $300,000 a year, $250,000. The Southerners may be unusual in that they have chosen to leave the South, at least temporarily, and come to school in the North. We suspect both of these factors work against us, and they're right, they would, and that regional differences would be bigger if representative samples of Northerners and Southerners were examined. Thus, our sample probably provides for a rather conservative test of our hypothesis, and they don't mean conservative in Republicans and Democrats. They mean conservative is that it's more cautious, which is the root of the word conservative. The 3 experiments we report all include the same basic manipulation. A confederate, and probably not the best word here since the association with the South, a confederate in our research is a person who is an actor. So an actor of the experimenter bumps into an unsuspected participant as he walks down a hallway and calls the participant an asshole. I can swear officially. Look at that. It's in writing. The 3 experiments focused on the different behavioral, cognitive, emotional, and physiological effects of the insults. In experiment 1, we examined the effect of the insult on the immediate emotional reaction of the participant and on subsequently expressed hostility during the rest of the experiment. Subsequent hostility was assessed with a word completion task, a face rating task, and a neutral scenario completion task to see if the participant would project his anger onto these stimuli. So let's just get our mind right. Subsequent hostility was assessed with a word completion task. You can imagine a word that has like a word like anger, right? And you could have blank, blank, G-E-R, A-N-G-E-R, or H-U. Okay, I messed that one up. But you get the idea, right? How do they complete the word, right? If you just have like a blank, say, make a word out of this end thing, G-E-R, are they putting G-R-Y, right? If you just put G-R-Y on there, are they writing angry? Are they writing hungry? Are they writing something else, right? Face rating task, a neutral face, do they see it as hostile and threatening? And a neutral scenario completion task, so if they see a neutral scenario, is this person being aggressive towards me? Right? We also assessed hostility by having the participant complete the ending of a scenario that involved affront and sexual challenge. So they saw a scenario, how should this person respond or how should you respond? These procedures allowed us to examine whether A, relatively neutral stimuli would bring out aggression after priming by the insult, or B, only subsequent stimuli that also involve affront or challenge would bring out aggression. In either case, a positive result calls for an interaction effect of regional origin, they're just talking stats here, and insult with Southerners reacting with more aggression after an insult than Northerners. Our theory led us to predict that this interaction would definitely be obtained when subsequent stimuli involve issues of insult or challenge. However, it was an open question whether the interaction would also be obtained for ambiguous or neutral stimuli. We did not make predictions regarding whether the interaction would occur on the face rating, word completion, or neutral scenario task. We believed, however, that it would be informative to examine these variables in an exploratory way to see how specific or general the effect of the insult was. The experiment involved a 2x2 design. That means you have two independent variables with two levels each. With the participants' region of origin, north versus south, the first two has one variable and condition, insulted versus not insulted, has the other variable. Participants were 83 University of Michigan white male undergraduates, 42 Northern, 41 Southern, who were recruited by telephone and paid $5 for their time. I mean, they're rich, so you gotta pay them a lot, I guess. Haha. Students who lived in the South for a period of at least 6 years were considered Southern. The South was defined as census divisions 5, 6, and 7. This includes the states of Delaware, Maryland, West Virginia, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Kentucky, Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, Oklahoma, Louisiana, and Texas. In this experiment, as in experiments 2 and 3, students from Washington, D.C. and from towns we could identify as its immediate suburbs were excluded because D.C. is probably not representative of either Northern or Southern culture. All other students were considered Northern. So that all students would be equated, at least with respect to whether they had self-selected to attend school in another state. All participants were non-Michigan residents. On average, Southern students had spent 87% of their lives in the South, whereas Northern students had spent only 4% of their lives in the South. Jewish students were excluded because we hypothesized that Jewish culture might dilute regional differences. We are aware, however, that some researchers might have different intuitions on this matter. Students came to the laboratory of the Institute for Social Research, where they were informed that the experiment concerned the effects of limited response time conditions on certain facets of human judgment. After an initial introduction to the experiment, participants were told to fill out a short demographic questionnaire and were asked to take it to a table at the end of a long, narrow hallway. Let's look at this. What's going on here? So they were just told, hey, you're going to participate in this experiment on this lie, and then they walk down a hallway. This is where it gets good, right? So the participant's like taking something down the hallway. They're walking down the hallway. As the participant walked down the hall, a confederate of the experimenter walked out of the door marked Photo Lab and began working at a file cabinet in the hall. The confederate had to push the file drawer in to allow the participant to pass by him and drop his paper off at the table. As the participant returned seconds later and walked back down the hall towards the experimental room, the confederate, who had reopened the file drawer, slammed it shut on seeing the participant approach and bumped into the participant with his shoulder, calling the participant an asshole. Okay, I just want to point out, an IRB board did approve this and still would, so I just want to point out that you can do some cool stuff in psychology. The Confederate then walked back into the photo lab. 2 observers were stationed in the hall. They appeared to be working on homework, paying no attention to the goings-ons in the hall. One male observer was seated on the floor in a location where he could glance up and see the participant's face. At the moment, he was bumped. The other female observer was sitting at the table at the end of the hall where she could glance at the participant's face if he turned around, which occurred about 86% of the time across experiments 1 and 3. Both observers could hear everything the participant said and could read his body language, though from different perspectives. Immediately after the bumping incident, the observers rated the participants' emotional reactions on 7-point scales. The reactions of anger and amusement were the ones of greatest interest, but observers also rated how aroused, flustered, resigned, or wary participants seemed. The correlation for the 2 observers' judgments was 0.52 for amusement and 0.57 for anger. So that means the 2 participants kind of agreed, but not much. You really want those to be in the 0.8, 0.9 range. But they had different perspectives, so I guess that makes a little bit more sense. They're seeing different things. Observers also rated the effectiveness of the bump. There was no north-south difference on this rating. Observers, of course, did not know the regional origin of the participant. Participants who were assigned to the control condition completed the same procedures without being bumped. Obviously, there were no observers and hence no ratings of emotional reactions in the control condition. After the participant returned to the room, the judgment task began. The first task was a word completion task in which the participant was given a string of letters, blank, IGHT, or GRU, blank. He could complete either in a hostile way, fight or gun, or in a non-hostile way, light or gum. See, they did a better job of explaining that to you. The second task was a face rating task in which the participant tried to guess which emotion was being expressed in a series of photographs of faces: anger, fear, disgust, sadness, or happiness. Those are the 5 emotions that psychologists believe in. The third task was a scenario completion task in which the participant needed to fill in the beginning or ending of a story. In one scenario, a man was rescued by an ambulance, and the participant was asked to fill in the beginning of the story. The other scenario involved issues of affront and challenge. The scenario began: it had only been about 20 minutes since they had arrived at the party when Jill pulled Steve aside, obviously bothered about something. "What's wrong?" asked Steve. "It's Larry. I mean, he knows that you and I are engaged, but he's already made 2 passes at me tonight." Jim walked back into the crowd, and Steve decided to keep his eye on Larry. Sure enough, within 5 minutes, Larry was reaching over and trying to kiss Jill. Uh-oh. Participants were asked to complete the ending of the story, right? And you could imagine what's going to go on here. A northerner and a southerner. How are they going to respond to this? After all tasks were completed, participants were thoroughly debriefed and reconciled with the bumper. Okay, so they were told it was an experiment and everything was cool. The debriefer explained why the research was important and why the deception and insult were used. This is good modeling of deception research, right? The bumper met the participants and talked with them to make sure they were not upset or angered by the experience. Informal conversations made it clear that participants were not unhappy with the treatment accorded them and understood the reasons for it. Also, look here, this meets the definition of murder that we talked about before, right? They apologized, they took it back, they took the insult and threat back. So there's no reason left to feel upset. You know, in that situation with Frisbee, if that guy would have said, "Man, I'm sorry, I was being a jerk," I'd have been like, "Yeah, you were being a jerk, but I appreciate it," right? Let's get a beer, right? It's one of those things. To establish this in a more formal way, we asked several questions of participants at the end of the debriefing in Experiment 2. We asked participants how interested they were by the experiment on a scale that ranged from 0, not at all, to 7, extremely. The modal answer was 7, and the mean was 5.8. So they were very interested in the experiment. It's a cool experiment, right? They statistically showed their experiment was cool. We asked how glad participants were that they had been in the experiment. The mode was again 7, with 96% of participants at or above the midpoint of the scale. Participants also were asked how angry they were at having been in the experiment. 89% of participants answered 0, and no participant answered as high as the midpoint on the scale. In fact, on every measure, insulted participants were more favorable towards the experiment than controls. Right? So actually, those that were insulted and liked the experiment more. Great. Now we're on to our results and discussion. Northerners and Southerners differed in how angry or amused they appeared to be after the bump. Observers rated Northern participants as significantly more amused by the bump than Southern participants. Research methods students, look at this sentence. It's amazing. So you got this sentence that clearly states what they found. Then you got northern mean. See, they labeled it. Northern mean equals 2.77. Southern mean equals 1.74. Then it continues. T-test. T with 41 degrees of freedom equals 2.85. P is less than 0.01. It's significant. And then they add a comma. And Southern participants tended to be more angry than Northern participants. Northern mean, Southern mean, T-score. The only thing I would say they should include are standard deviations in parentheses after those means. This is how you present results. This is a good sentence. Every one of you should copy this sentence and keep it for when you take research methods, or if you take research methods, because this is how you should write your results. Means and standard deviations for these and other key variables are presented in the appendix. So they gave me the means and standard deviations in the appendix. They're making my life easy. We subtracted the amusement rating from the anger rating for each participant to show that and look at that. Look at the method they used. Do I have a problem with that? Not at all, right? They're having two measures of how upset this person is, and they're putting them together through math. As may be seen in Table 1, the most common emotional reaction for Northerners was to show more amusement than anger. The overwhelmingly dominant reaction for Southerners was to show as much or more anger than amusement. There were no significant differences on how aroused, flustered, resigned, or wary participants seemed to be. So we can look at Table 1. We can find it. There we go. Okay, so it's just some basic numbers. Percentage anger ratings has high or higher than amusement ratings. So 85% of Southerners were more angered than amused. 35% of Northerners were more angered than amused. And then the other one's just the converse. That's a weird table. I don't know if they needed that. I wouldn't have had that table in my work. So they were angry. Projective hostility. We examined whether the insult would make Southerners more hostile while leaving Northerners unaffected. So these are all the projective hostilities, how you put hostility on other objects. So word completion. The insult did not significantly affect either Southerners or Northerners. There also was no main effect of either region or insult. So in terms of word completion, there was nothing. More footnotes, if you want to read those, I'm good. Face rating. Southerners were not more likely to project anger, disgust, fear, happiness, or sadness onto faces shown to them after the insult than were Northerners. There was, again, no main effect of either region or insult for any of these ratings except for happiness. I'm going to tell you right now, they predicted these things to work out, but they didn't find it. Back in the 90s, well, in social psychology in general, we want to see like cognitive, behavioral, emotional, motivational changes. So like they predicted changes here. Scenario completions. There were no region, insult, or interaction effects on how likely participants were to begin the ambulance scenario with interpersonal violence. In sum, none of the projective measures showed a differential impact of the insult as a function of the participant's regional origin. This was not true, however, for the insult scenario. Insult prime scenario. For the scenario, this is the one we were talking about earlier. This is good. For the scenario describing the attempted pass of the fiancé, there was a significant interaction between region and insult. If Southerners were insulted, they were much more likely to end the scenario with violence, whereas Northerners were unaffected by the insult. And this might be like a tendency, like they didn't get to act with violence, but like it was building up in them, and so they were thinking about acting with violence. It's kind of like the idea, to an insult only. 75% of insulted Southerners completed the scenario with events in which the man injured or threatened to injure his challenger, was only 20% of control Southerners did so. This is called a chi-square test. Not going to explain it to you, but it tests differences in percentages. Northerners were unaffected by the manipulation, being somewhat less likely to conclude this scenario with violence if they had been insulted. To examine the interaction between region and insult, we performed an analysis of variance on a 3-level variable: no violence, violence suggested, actual violence. Higher numbers indicated greater violence, and means were Southern insult 2.30, Southern control 1.40, Northern insult 1.73. So these are like, look at the scale. It's I'm guessing 1, 2. Yep, definitely it has to be 1, 2, and 3. No violence. If they didn't mention violence, that was rated as a 1. If they did suggest, like violence suggested, if you don't take that back, I'm going to murder you, right? And actual violence, the person punched them, right? So 2 and 3. We can see here that the average Southerner was in between suggesting violence, you take it back or I will murder you, and actual violence, just murdering them, essentially. Southern control was one of the lowest groups ever, which is really interesting. It's only in that state of, culture of honor attack that people completed this scenario violently. So it's a person by situation interaction. A Southerner who's been raised in a culture to accept violence in response to one's own honor, right? Only engage with acceptable thoughts of behavior as violence when they are dishonored. So I think that's a really interesting point right there. Overall, they're lower too. The Southern control group is lower than the Northern control and Northern insult groups in general. So it's like a Dr. Jekyll Hyde situation going on here. If you don't know that, that's like a classic story where scientist is a nice guy and then he takes this medicine and becomes like a complete murderer. But overall, I think those are interesting data. So what did you learn from experiment 1, right? Well, we learned that, number 1, people are more, Southerners when insulted are more emotionally affected, more angered by the insult. And the only other thing that I saw was that they were also more likely to complete this story with violence if it involved an honor threat. So, those are the things we saw. I think it gives us some insight that, Southerners are a little bit more violent than Northerners, but it's not giving me too much insight. I didn't see behaviors. I didn't see acts of violence. I didn't see any of the projection stuff. I don't know why they're acting with violence. Like, it's not because they're viewing people as more aggressive or anything like that. And I don't know why they go from being the sweetest sweethearts to being the most detrimental, like fighting people in the world. And you can see, if you're like, wait, what do you mean sweethearts? Right here, 140, Southern control. Lower, substantially lower than all the other groups, and versus 230. This is a sweetheart number, and this is somebody you watch out for, and you don't want to be hurt by, but this is just on a story completion task. So they go from not thinking about violence at all as an act for someone else's behavior to thinking that it's the only acceptable response. Let's see what they say. Experiment 1 indicated that Southerners were likely to see the insult as a cause for anger rather than amuse it, whereas Northerners were not much affected by the insult, taking it as a cause more for amusement than anger, based on observations of others. I don't really like that measure. I don't think it's a great measure. So I'm gonna want to see other studies. Like, if this is all they had, I wouldn't believe them. In addition, Southerners, but not Northerners, were much more likely to complete the affront script with violence if they had been insulted than if they had not. This greater hostility on the part of insulted Southerners, which I think calling it hostility is a little much, like greater anger and greater, like I think that sentence needs to be fixed. Greater anger and greater perceptions of the acceptability of violence in a random situation. That's different than hostility. Was manifested only in response to the affront prime. However, However? You're just going to end with however? However? Oh, wow. I would never end a sentence with however, but I see it's a good tool. Might put that one in my writing toolbox. Insulted Southerners were no more likely to project hostility onto neutral stimuli than were other participants. These findings indicate that an insult may make a Southern male angry and may lower his threshold for anger in response to subsequent affronts without necessarily producing hostility in response to innocuous stimuli. Now, from a cultural perspective, this makes sense, right? If you're in a culture where your honor gets threatened and your response is supposed to be, like act with violence, other people now have to worry about being acted with violence when they didn't insult anybody. And these studies right here show that that's not how the culture works. It's only when people are in those direct experiences do they experience aggression. They don't perceive anger in others. They're not more likely to perceive a random individual as hostile. The assumption being that they'd then be more likely to act with violence against them. They're only more likely to view violence as an appropriate response to a hypothetical situation. And according to some observers, they look more angry and less amused if they are in the South, okay, or from the South. In experiment 2, we explored whether, for Southerners, responses to insult go beyond annoyance and mere cognitive priming for aggression and are accompanied by physiological changes of a sort that might mediate genuine behavioral aggression. We also attempted to test whether insulted Southerner participants would be motivated to demonstrate their toughness. We examined 4 major variables. Physiological measure of stress. To measure how upset or stressed the participant became, we examined the cortisol level of the participant before and after the bump. Cortisol is a hormone associated with high levels of stress, anxiety, and arousal in humans and in animals. If Southerners are more upset by the acute stress of the insult, they should show a rise in cortisol levels compared with control participants. If Northerners are relatively unaffected by the insult, as they seem to be in experiment 1, they should show little or no rise in cortisol levels compared with control participants. To measure how prepared for future challenges the participants became, we examined their testosterone levels before and after the bump. Testosterone is a hormone associated with aggression and dominance behavior in animals and both male and female humans. The causation seems to go both ways. High levels of testosterone facilitate dominance or aggressive behavior, and successful dominance encounters lead to increases in testosterone. Research has suggested that testosterone plays a role in preparing participants for competitions or dominance contests. Higher testosterone, look at all the citations there. This is a great sentence for those of you that have to write a paper, for me. And yeah, I want 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 citations per idea. That tells me that idea is true, right? Like, if you're just writing with one piece of evidence, look at how the pros do it. Look up here, and some of these are the same. That's fine, right? But they're proving every point they make with 5, 6 citations. And if they can't, you got to be wary of it. Higher testosterone levels, look at how they state it differently. Like, may facilitate versus has suggested. Higher testosterones may facilitate the aggressive behaviors and display of dominant cues that make one act and even look tougher. In addition, testosterone may raise fear thresholds. In male rats, injections of testosterone act as an anxiolytic agent, reducing the rat's fear, that's anxiety reducing the rat's fear of novel environments. It would obviously be useful in challenge or competition situations if this fear-reducing effect were to occur in humans. If Southerners respond to the insult as a challenge and prepare themselves for future aggression or dominance contests, we might expect a testosterone increase after the bump. If Northerners are relatively unaffected, we would not expect their testosterone levels to rise very much. Desire of the participant to demonstrate toughness. We also gave participants an opportunity to demonstrate their toughness by committing themselves to take shock in an electric shock stress test. Woo! Participants had a public opportunity to demonstrate their toughness in front of 2 male Confederates, and they had a private opportunity to reconsider their commitment after the Confederates left the room. We examined the public minus private discrepancy and shock taking as a measure of the participant's desire to demonstrate toughness to his audience. We anticipated that Southerners would show a greater desire to demonstrate toughness after being assaulted than would Northerners. Look at this. They do it by themselves in a room. They do it in front of other people. It's the difference that measures toughness. These are amazingly creative measures. Anybody who's a psych major, pay attention. Your research methods experiments can be way more interesting, way cooler. Look at how they're thinking about it. Look at how they did it, right? Look at how they used others in their studies, right? This is good science. This is high quality science. This is why we're still talking about it 30 some years later, I think. Yeah, 96. I don't know. Math's off today. Yeah, 20 some years later. This is one of the classics of psychology, particularly the classics of social psychology. Interpretation of ambiguous stimuli. They're going to give this one again. Experiment 1. Insulted Southerners did not... So here's what I know right now. They believed these were going to work. They kept testing to see if they worked. They kept not working is going to be my guess. Or they worked, and now they... Yeah. One of the things I don't like is hypothesizing after the results are collected, which I call by another name lying. And so I would rather them just be honest with me that they wanted to see if this would still work, and they ran these two experiments at the same time. I appreciate the honesty. I don't appreciate being lied to. I think they're lying to me. This was standard practice back in the day. It was to tell the best story in your science. So that's why when you read a paper from 96 versus 2020, the 96 paper is more interesting and more coherent, and the 2020 paper is like more difficult to read but has better statistics and better like descriptions of science in it. So this has been the transition from the 90s to today in psychology. Our field is much more scientific now and much more better because we're not hypothesizing after the results are collected. In experiment 2, we examined whether insulted Southerners would project more hostility onto ambiguous scenarios in which there is only the possibility that an affront or challenge is being offered. Okay, I can appreciate the change there. I'll take my words back. Again, we included these ambiguous stimuli as exploratory variables to see how general or how specific the effect of the insult would be. In experiment 2, we also examined the importance of the public versus private nature of the insult, predicting that all insult effects would be greater if the insults were carried out publicly. Now, let's just take a moment here, right? We got desire to express toughness, this desire to show that one is not to be messed with, an actual chance to increase one's reputation. We have these cortisol measures, which to me are showing... kind of went too far there, are showing to me that, folks are biologically prepared for this. Like their culture is changing their biological response. Now, this fits in very well with my pain research, right? Being socially excluded drastically alters your pain response, makes it more sensitive, right? Which we observed in my research that covered people of color across the world, right? Our cultural experiences shape our biological response. There's no other way culture works. I mean, so it's one of those connectors, one of those pieces of the interface, right? Well, but it's more on the human side. It's sort of like what culture does to us is it impacts our biology. And guess what? We're not very thoughtful about our own biology. This actually makes sense why culture controls us so much. It impacts biology, and we're not very sensitive to our own biology. Like for example, I don't know what my blood glucose level is right now. I don't know what my testosterone level is right now. I don't think about that stuff. But those are the things that are being changed, and that's one of the main ways that culture is impacting us on the human side. It's altering those biological responses to frankly control us and make us do stuff that could kill us. Okay? So let's get to our method, right? Sorry, I was coherent in my thoughts, but not coherent in where I was on the page. Participants were 173 white male undergraduates at the University of Michigan who were recruited by telephone and paid $10 this time. Ooh, I guess they found out they were rich and had to pay them more. Again, students were considered Southern if they had spent at least 6 years in the South. All other students were considered, Northern. On average, Southern participants had spent 81% of their lives in the South compared with the Northern participants who had spent only 3% of their lives in the South. Again, Black, Jewish, Hispanic, and Michigan residents were excluded. Procedure. Participants were met in the laboratory by an experimenter who explained that the experiment concerned people's performance on task under various conditions. Look at that research method, students. People will buy that. They'll be like, oh, yes, I'm going to look at my performance under various conditions. This right here is the A+ cover story move. The experimenter said that she would be measuring the participants' blood sugar levels throughout the experiment by taking saliva samples. Another lie, right? But still works. To get a bit can you even get blood sugar levels by taking saliva samples? I actually don't think so. Man, but if you're in an experiment, you're not thinking about it. To get a baseline measurement, the participants were given a piece of sugarless gum to generate saliva. This is where it might make sense, right? A test tube to fill to 5 millimeter level and a brief questionnaire to fill out as he provided the first saliva sample. After the saliva sample was given, the participant was sent down the hall to drop off his questionnaire and was bumped and insulted as described in experiment 1. The participant was either bumped publicly, bumped privately, or not at all. This is a good, why would you add a public and private condition? If it's all about reputation, you don't expect these results to occur when it's in private. The arguments that you get with your friends behind closed doors don't ruin your reputation. Or arguments that you get in where nobody else can see don't ruin your reputation. The participant was either bumped publicly or bumped privately or not at all. In the public condition, there were 2 witnesses to the insult, just like in experiment 1. Both witnesses were Confederates who were identified as fellow participants by the experimenter before the participant began his walk down the hall. They made it clear that these people were there. Both observers made eye contact with the participant so that he knew they had witnessed the incident. So they look at him, they give him that that meme of that little that raccoon thing looking at you in the eye. Both observers made eye contact with the participant so that he knew they had witnessed the incident. In the private condition, there were no observers in the hallway. In the control condition, the participant was not bumped or insulted. And they liked it less if you looked at experiment 1. They wanted to be in the bump study. As the participant walked down the hall, he continued to chew the sugarless gum and was told not to talk while he had the gum in his mouth. He was to keep the participant from talking to observers after the insult in the public condition. Oh, not he was. I don't know where that came from. As witnesses to the insult, the public observers rated the participants' emotional reaction to the bump. No private observation could be made because there were no observers in the hall for the private bump in this experiment. Use video cameras in the future, folks, but this is 96. They were kind of expensive, but they existed because we used them when we skated, so I know they were around. In all conditions, observers and Confederates were, of course, aware of condition, but did not know whether the participant was a Southerner or a Northerner. After a few minutes, the participant and 2 Confederates were called to the experimental room. In the public condition, the Confederates were the people who had seen the participant be insulted. The experimenter explained that they would be performing mechanical aptitude tasks while taking the electric shock stress test. She said that the test was a great indicator of general physical and mental toughness, and that the U.S. Air Force, look at that, administers it. Look at how they're setting up their measures, y'all. You can do this too. Take some time, take some creativity. And that, a lot of people think science is all boring. This study disproves that idea for sure. That the U.S. Air Force administers to its most badass fighter pilots. This is a manipulation. This is a psychological thing that's important. She explained that participation was optional, but that if participants chose to take part, they would receive 1 shock a minute for 10 minutes at a level of their choice between 10 and 250 volts. That's a lot of shock. 250 volts is a lot. I think that'll kill you, actually. She asked the 2 Confederates how many volts they would like to take. One asked for 75, the other for 25. The participant was then asked for his choice. Participants had Confederates filled the participants and Confederates filled out a medical inventory to see if they could continue with the procedure. The experimenter then took the two Confederates out of the experimental room, ostensibly to get them set up in their separate rooms. The participant was then asked to give another saliva sample. On average, the sample was given 13 minutes after the first test. After a few minutes, the experimenter returned and informed the participant that the Confederate who selected 25 volts could not continue with the experiment. Participants presumably would reckon this was for health reasons. The experimenter allowed the participant the opportunity to switch to the Confederate's 25 volt level if he wanted. Genius. Weird. Doesn't make any sense. Why would I switch? But people don't think. When you're in the experimental situation, you're just like doing what people are asking you. This is also a good wake-up call to like your responsibility in these experiments. In the case of 71% of participants, the 25 volt level was lower than the one they had selected for themselves. Each participant's choice constituted his private level of commitment to electric shock. After the participant either changed his level or held it, the experimenter asked him to fill out an opinion test. The questionnaire had a number of scenarios that were ambiguous with respect to whether an insult had been delivered. In one scenario, for example, one character cuts another off as they are driving down the road. For each situation, the participant was asked to guess the likelihood of either a physical fight or verbal argument occurring. After the participant finished the questionnaire, he was asked to give another saliva sample. So they're just recording like testosterone and cortisol throughout this experiment. Look at that too. Multiple measures. This study is legit good. This is one of my favorite all times. On average, this third sample was given 25 minutes after the first. We timed the second and third samples at these intervals after consulting with experts who believe that testosterone changes could be detected in saliva between 10 and 30 minutes after the bump. So awesome. Participants were extensively debriefed and reconciled with the bumper as in experiment 1. No participants were actually shocked during the experiment. Oh, nobody was shocked to a point that was deadly? Oh, God, no, nobody was shocked to a point that was deadly. All right, that's probably the point where they're like, we're not going to shock you. I love this experiment. It's so great, right? It puts people in this situation of showing they're tough, of being bumped, of measuring their biology, right? This is getting at the core. I already gave you a foreshadowing of it, but like the core of why this experiment is cool is because it tells us that culture is going to control your biology. You're going to see that in a second, unless I'm wrong. I haven't read this in a few years, but that's how I remember it. Let's see if I was right. That publicly insulted participants would show a more extreme pattern of responses than privately insulted participants. However, this did not happen, so we collapsed publicly and privately insulted participants into one insult condition. This should raise red flags for you, and you should think about it. So we got to take a moment. We got to say, okay, wait. So let's get it out of what they predicted, and let's get it out to what we understand about how the world works. So I would predict that publicly you should see more extreme results than privately. But then I reflected back on my experience as a young kid, and I'm like, oh wait, if one person insults you in private and you're like, oh man, I don't want to do anything, like whatever, they can tell 100 other people, and next thing you know, you're getting a basketball thrown at your head, and you're getting beat up, you're getting like wedgied, you're getting bullied, you're getting swirlied, like all that horrible stuff, right? So I can see, like, it doesn't matter if one person insults you or if 20 see it, because we can talk. It's our reputation that matters. Humans gossip. If somebody had a situation where they quote unquote punked somebody in the bathroom, right, and it was all private, they're going to tell everybody at that school. They're going to tell everybody in that culture. If somebody if one person steals one sheep from you, right, and they tell other people, everybody else is going to steal sheep from you too. So one versus many doesn't really matter when you take the perspective from somebody who's lived in one of these environments. So it makes sense to me now. Emotion ratings. Experiment 2 as well as experiment 3, which is reported subsequently, yielded weak and inconsistent results regarding the emotional reaction to the bump. We believe this was because of the requirement to chew gum. Totally, your face expresses most of your emotion, and not to talk. In experiments 2 and 3, which prohibited the free expression of emotion. Of course, this is a post hoc explanation, but it makes sense. At least they're calling it that. And the results of experiment 1 regarding anger and amusement must be treated with caution until subsequent research replicates the findings of experiment 1 in ecologically natural circumstances. So they're saying, can we see this in the real world? Let's just leave it for now. Cortisol levels. We averaged the 2 post-bump measurements, and I don't know anything about measuring cortisol, so I'm just gonna, they might have things wrong here, but I don't know. So we averaged the 2 post-bump measurements and then computed a change score. So they got average post-bump cortisol level minus pre-bump cortisol level. So that's controlling for baseline cortisol level, divided by pre-bump cortisol level. That's percentage change now. So yeah, because that's percentage change score. That's all it is. So percentage change based on their baseline level. So yeah, perfect. Has maybe seen in figure 1, cortisol levels rose 79% for insulted Southerners and 42% for control Southerners. They rose 33% for insulted Northerners and 39% for control Northerners. Don't kid yourself. If I bump you, chances are, you're gonna have a 1/3 rise in the hormone that increases your stress response. You're gonna prepare for battle. And that's what this shows us. But if you're from the South, you're going into battle. You think it's a major threat, not a minor threat. And that's basically what we're seeing here. I bet if we took what the Northerners cared about and did the equivalent of bumping them, their cortisol levels would rise to 79%. In fact, I wonder if this is the same as worried about failing a test. I wonder if tests are more important than one's honor to a college student. But let's keep reading. We had predicted that insulted Southerners would show large increases in cortisol levels, whereas control Southerners and both insulted and control Southerners would show smaller changes. This was because in the absence of provocation, there was no reason to assume the cortisol levels of Southerners would rise more than the cortisol levels of Northerners. It is only after provocation that we expected Southerners to show cortisol increases over the level of Northerners and over the level of control groups. The appropriate contrast to test this prediction. Now, contrast is like this right here is a t-test, but it's a special t-test where different groups are paired together. So this group of +3 is Southerners who were insulted. So that group is weighted at a value of +3. And all that, it doesn't mean their numbers change. It just means they are being compared against the other 3 groups. So for every group you have in a contrast, those numbers have to sum to 0 because you're comparing the one group, the insulted Southerners, to all the other groups. And then this contrast was significant. Southerners insulted had significantly higher cortisol response than other groups. I do want to point out that they didn't run the same ANOVA because it wouldn't have worked out statistically. P less than 0.03 is basically on the edge, right? You're basically close to a P greater than 0.05. And if you ran this as the factorial ANOVA, as they have been doing, you would see that it wouldn't work out. And then they report the residual between groups variance after the effect of the contrast removed was not significant. Don't worry about that. I'm just going to leave that there. But they report another F statistic, which should be a little bit of, if you're using contrast here, why not use contrast there? And so I just want you to see this. There's a game involved in science. That is bullshit, and it's ruining our science, where you have to get P less than 0.05 to publish, even when you have amazing data like this. Right? I'm sure a P equal to 0.06 here, isn't going to change my opinion on whether or not this actually worked. Right? If you look at all the measures together and run a meta-analysis on this data by itself, you're going to find that the average effect is large and present. But I do want you to know that. I want A lot of us have been trained in p-values in high school, which kind of confuses me because nobody ever taught me about a p-value in high school. I was too busy ducking basketballs, I guess. But ultimately, like that's like p-values are crappy, and you know, when we're trying to hack our data, which this is a clear case of p hacking to me, doing a different analysis than you would have normally done to like get a result that is acceptable in the field. Instead, I would much rather prefer the the 2 by 2 ANOVAs that they were doing before. So northern, southerner, insulted, not insulted. The switch to this tells me that result wouldn't have been significant in that way. And it's probably the same for this testosterone, because as I was talking to you, I was glancing over and I saw the same contrast down there. So so they did the same thing with cortisol, they got the average change. That's the first sentence. We're skipping that. Testosterone levels rose 12% for insulted southerners and 4% for control southerners. So that's a 300% in difference, right? They rose 6% for insulted northerners and 4% for control northerners. So our testosterone, if you're from a culture of honor culture, is twice as great if you're insulted than if you're from a non-culture of honor culture. Then they use the contrast, and I just explained that to you. They're p hacking here, so you got to take this with a grain of salt. I do believe that these results exist, but I know that p would be less than 0.03 for the interaction, right? That they're predicting, because they're predicting an interaction here. It would be non-significant. But also p-values are crap, and what I care about is something called partial eta squared in this case, which tells you the percentage of variation in your dependent variable that is accounted for by your independent variable. We've actually seen partial eta squared before. I just didn't talk about it. It's a little n with a p and a 2 above it. So it's a Greek n, eta. Don't worry about that too much, but you can see that overall there were biological changes. I think they p hacked. You could also learn this is how you p hack. But also, right, there's some evidence, and I'm going to say some evidence, not strong evidence. I'm going to say some evidence that the biology is being changed. So after this reread, my opinion has changed a little bit on the biological piece. It's not as strong as I would have liked, but also, you know, I kind of know the position of these other social psychologists, right? We got into social psychology because we're interested in social issues. Many of us might have failed out of biology in our quest to become a doctor that we quickly realized wasn't going to happen, right? These are things that matter to us, right? And so, like, you put one of us in a situation where we're measuring biological responses and we don't understand it that well. You know, it could have been, you know, collecting the data, analyzing the data, storing the data. There's quite a bit of room for like error and stuff. So like, I don't know. Ultimately, I think there is some biological change here. I think they do have evidence for that. I like their contrasted tests, but to me, it's clear that it's a p hacking move. They're clearly hacking their p level. But you know, I still believe there's something there. I just don't believe it's super strong anymore. Shock levels. There was no effect for region, insult, or the interaction. And see, they do them here. They do the ANOVAs right next. We compared the difference between how much shock the participant chose to receive in public minus how much they chose in private. There was no effect of the insult and no interaction between insult and region. There was, however, a significant main effect for region. Southerners, whether insulted or not, chose to receive more shock in public than did in private. Now, let me take this for a moment. While they didn't predict this, I think their original predictions were silly, right? Public and private, there's still another person there. You're still there as the experimenter. The whole gossip problem exists here. So their in private condition wasn't actually in private. You need to let them choose what number on the shock generator to push. And you need to actually have them take shock. Not 250 volts because that'll kill you. Trust me. Trust me on that one. I've worked with solar panels. You don't want 250 volts going across your heart, all right? But, like, how many shocks on a 9-volt battery do you take to your skin? Right? You've put a 9-volt battery on your tongue. I can't believe, like, my students are telling me that they didn't do this when they were kids. I did this all the time. Whenever I even now, if I find a 9-volt battery in an old tool, I put it on my tongue to see if it shocks me, right? Like come on. Like, how many 9-volt shocks do you take? How many do you say you're going to take? Anyways, that's how I would roll. But Southerners are overall saying they'll take more shocks when anyone's around. Makes sense to me, right? Shows you're tough. 270 volts will kill you, but you're saying I'll take that? Oh yeah, you're tough. The ambiguous insult scenarios. There was no effect for region insult or the interaction on whether participants expected the ambiguous scenarios to end with either physical or verbal aggression. So this study is a little bit weaker statistically, right? You have the contrast effects that work out, but nothing else really worked out as they predicted. But I also think we learned from this experiment. Now there's p hacking going on, there's harking going on here, and I think their harking is more clearly pointed out. But ultimately, like, there's deception in science, and you need to be able to pick that out. And you can see there's some deception, and I don't mean deception in participants. There's deception in presenting results honestly. For me, there's nothing more annoying than seeing somebody switch their analysis for the same type of dependent variable, just for the same design, just for a different type of dependent variable. That's annoying to me. They're p-hacking. You gotta be critical here, okay? I was talking to some students who were telling me about, like, when they hear me read these videos, they never thought that they could question science. Science is humans, man. Just because it's published doesn't mean it's great. I'll tell you the 7 things wrong with my actual study that other people like. Number 1, I have very small participant number in my study. So, like, the one with the race, the pain, and the empathy. I have replicated it in other settings with other researchers, but ultimately there are flaws in all research. I really believe in my research, but the flaws are there. I just leave my flaws open for everyone to see. A good scientist is like Eminem and 8 Mile. They just tell everybody everything they did wrong. Okay. And if you haven't seen 8 Mile, it's a great movie, and judge me for liking crappy cinema. That's fine. Experiment 1. Oh, and we can look here at the changes in cortisol level. They explained it pretty well. I mean, we could have skipped that whole section on cortisol by just reading the picture, but we didn't know we could skip it. But look here, you got the control, you got the same percentage of change. And you got the insult. So what's that tell you? So why did I pause? I'm like, why would there be any percentage change when nothing happened to them? Well, they're still in an experiment. It's a psych experiment. We have a reputation for, doing things to people, like, insulting them and seeing how many shocks they'll take, but not telling them, right? So people are experiencing some trepidation, right? After the insults, right? In terms of the insults, like northern subjects, their cortisol level appears to go down a little bit from control. It's probably not significant, but it is a decrease. And, it just makes me wonder, like, did they figure out that this was the experiment? Is their culture, it's not a culture of honor, but a culture of emotional control? Sort of like, do y'all know Steve McQueen? Steve McQueen is in The Great Escape and in Bullet, this amazing, like, movie from the 60s. And Steve McQueen was just the quintessential no emotional, like, no bullshit guy that you want to be your leader in a difficult situation, right? So in the North, right, is being calm as a cucumber desired. And so one's just really honed in on the fact that they're not calm as a cucumber and they need to get there. And so then they downregulate their cortisol, likely with their MPFC. Haha, remember that from a few from a few from Helen's study a few weeks back. And then you see this massive increase in cortisol, which is a stress hormone for Southern subjects. I want to see if I can find, they have to have, there we go. Let's see testosterone, right? Different scale. It's not as massive of an increase, but it's a 15% increase for these Southern subjects. It is quite an increase. There appears to be like a little bit of an increase in testosterone for Northern subjects, showing us that these two measures aren't the same thing. They're measuring different things. This is preparedness for aggression, and the other is preparedness for stress. So experiencing stress over the insult, right? It looks like Northerners were better at not experiencing stress, being calm as cucumbers. But Northerners are kind of preparing to get down too, just a little bit. They're not as prepared as Southerners, but they're preparing too, just a little bit. Now these differences aren't significant, but sometimes smaller patterns are hard to see. This whole p-value greater than 0.05, the two means are the same is actually a wrong interpretation. When your p is greater than 0.05, you know nothing. So these two dots, which are not significantly different, they could be the same. Or they could be different. I don't know. I know nothing. But if I keep seeing this pattern in multiple studies, I'm going to think, okay, they're showing a slight increase. And this is why we got to move beyond p-value a little bit. There's other tests called equivalence tests that allow us to test if these two means are the same. Okay? But overall, we're seeing some evidence. The pictures are more convincing than their p hacking, okay? But ultimately, I still think there's something there. I just am not as strong in my belief in it. Experiment 1 indicated that although Northerners were able to brush off the insult, remain unaffected by it, maybe a little strong, less affected by it, maybe. Southerners were not able to do so and became primed for aggression if given the right stimulus. Experiment 2 showed that Southerners became upset and prepared for aggression on the physiological level. Southerners were more stressed by the insult, as shown by the rise in their cortisol levels, and more primed for future aggression, as indicated by the rise in their testosterone levels. Cortisol and testosterone levels of Northerners were hardly affected by the insult. There was no indication that the insult made Southerners more... I don't know what that word is. Eager. I was like, Kager. What's the Kager? No, eager. It's like there's an E there, but this is a photocopy. And so I lost that. Eager to demonstrate toughness. However, the shock test may have been too artificial. And no, you're viewed as... It's not in private, bro. Sorry. Sometimes when I see something and somebody else doesn't, I'm like, oh, don't you see what's going on here? You're a potential reputation ruiner. We don't trust you to keep your mouth shut. A graduate student experimenter that's likely 24 years old, okay? Versus a 19, 18, 20-year-old. Come on. It would have been hard for them to translate shot levels into anything familiar, and I don't buy that. I disagree. It's reputation. And it's okay to disagree. What would I do? I'd run an experiment to show that they were wrong. I'm going to keep reading because I know this is dragging on a little bit, but this is a fun study, so I know you're actually having a good time. We addressed this problem by giving participants a less artificial, more natural way to demonstrate toughness in experiment 3. The results for the ambiguous insult scenario are consistent with the results for the ambiguous materials in experiment 1. There is no evidence that insulted Southerners were more likely than other participants to see malevolent intent in the protagonist's action or to regard violence as an appropriate response to their actions. There are 2 plausible interpretations for this. The first is that it takes a clear-cut challenge or affront to bring out Southerners' increased hostility and aggressiveness. The second is that our ambiguous measures were too uninvolving to pick up the effects. Perhaps we might have seen increased hostility on the part of the insulted Southerners if we had examined real behavior after putting participants in an ambiguously insulting yet emotionally involving live situation. This is foreshadowing. Experiment 3. Why did that happen? Woo! I've figured out the backgrounds in here. I'm just making sure nobody's here to meet with me. Okay. I guess bumping that that was interesting. I don't know. Experiment 3 is one of the best studies I've ever seen, and it's hilarious, okay? We did not. So right now they're setting that up. They're saying like we want to look at real behavior. We don't have to read the rest of this. I'm gonna hook you up with experiment 3. In experiment 3, we tried to extend the results of experiments 1 and 2 by exploring whether Southerners would perceive an insult as damaging to their status and reputation, and would actually behave in a more aggressive and domineering ways after an insult. We examined 3 major sets of variables. Looks like the first is set. And look at how they use headings in their writing. Headings are amazing. You don't need transitions. They don't say the first heading is. They just say the first. We examined 3 major sets of variable, with the first being the masculine status. In a public insult condition, participants were bumped in front of an observer whom they later met. The participant task was to guess what the observer really thought of him. We expected Southerners to think that the observer would see them as less masculine or tough after witnessing the insult. I can attest. I believe that I would feel the same way. Northerners, however, should not feel that their status had been changed by the insult. So that's number 1. Perceived effect of the insult on one's masculine status. Do they view me as not a man after I take their hit? Aggressive behavior in a challenge situation after the insult. This is the measure that makes this entire paper one of the classics of social psychology. After the participant was bumped or not, he continued to walk down the long hallway. Another Confederate, who was 6'3" and 250 pounds. They don't say this in this paper, I don't believe, but this was a starting lineman for the University of Michigan football team. Let's go look at University of Michigan linemen compared to normal people. I'm just hoping I can find something good here. Oh yeah, this is a great one right here. Maybe it's not University of Michigan. It looks like Notre Dame from the back. I can't tell actually. Maybe it's Iowa. Maybe one of y'all. Maybe it is. That is University of Michigan for sure. Okay. Look at this guy. He's tiny. This is a lineman. This is the wall in your path. Right? That is the athlete that you are walking against. Look, I mean, these dudes are huge. They are terrifyingly huge. University of Michigan O-line. I'm just gonna go O-line. I'm just gonna see what I get here. Just to look at this dude. That dude is huge. Big old dude. Like you're gonna be like this dude is in this experiment. You just gotta understand how big these guys are. Like they are huge versus normal fan. Let's see that. Let's see what we get here. These are just coaches. Even the coaches are huge. Come on, let me see it. Let me see somebody here. I want to see another one. You got fans being upset. But I think you get my point. Like they're freaking huge, right? They're freaking huge, dude. So another Confederate, University of Michigan football player, appeared around the corner and began walking toward the participant at a good pace. The hall was lined with tables. So now you're in one of these hallways with tables. Not like one of our big old hallways. No. Normal size hallway. Maybe think more, not main hall, but Carroll. Think more Carroll, right? Put 2 tables in Carroll, and like you got one path, okay? You got a little bit of room there, but whatever. So the hall was lined with tables. So there was a room for only one person to pass without the other person giving way. The new Confederate walked down the center of the hall on a collision course with the participant and did not move, except at the last second to avoid bumping. What? This is great. It's, in essence, we set up a chicken game similar to that played by American teenagers who drive at each other in their cars. In its many forms, chicken games are important in cultures of honor in situations in which participants try to establish their toughness for status or strategic advantage. Y'all ever seen Footloose? Go look at the tractor scene from Footloose. That's a game of chicken, okay? The main dependent variable in this chicken game was the distance at which the participant decided to chicken out or give way to our University of Michigan football offensive lineman, right? Like, are you kidding me? This is one of the most creative experimental measures I have ever seen in my entire life. It's one of those ones that I'm like, wow, if I'd have thought of that, I'd really be happy. We expected insulted Southern participants to respond aggressively to the challenge and go farthest in this game. Game in quotation marks. Dominance behavior in subsequent encounters after the insults. After the participant was bumped or not and had returned to the experimental room, he had a brief meeting with another Confederate. This Confederate, the evaluator, was always the same person and was a 5'6" and 140 pounds, about the same height as me, 60 pounds less in weight than me. So just to put it in perspective, and all you know me, so there you go. The Confederate rated the firmness of the participant's handshake and the degree of eye contact, and he made summary. I love these measures; they're just so interesting. Made summary ratings of how domineering or submissive the participant was during the encounter, all on 7-point scales. Now, I'm not a fan of like trusting this as the only measure, but I like it. Like involving your experimenters has observers and has like a way to collect data is actually pretty interesting. It's not the cleanest way to do it, but sometimes it's the only way. We expected insulted Southern participants to be more domineering and less submissive after the insult, firmer handshakes, right? Like if your reputation is out there as negative, you gotta do what politicians do and you gotta clean up, right? If you look right now, you can see this all over our president's response to Corona. It's blaming who? It's blaming everyone but him, right? Look, so like you go out there, you present yourself as domineering to protect your reputation. And Trump needs to protect his reputation in the South. And if you look, a lot of the behaviors Trump does protects his reputation in the South. This can also help you understand Trump, just like the previous article that we just read as well, right? Like that whole Protestant work ethic article. So now we're getting a better insight into the voting, a likely insight into the voting patterns of people in our country, right? And the behavior of our president that seems strange to us over here with our like less aggressive Coloradan chill attitude, right? But make perfect sense to somebody that wants to win an election in the South and where the South provides a lot of the votes, right? Oh, I'm not afraid of no flu. I'm bigger than a flu. I'm a tough big guy, right? That's part of the culture of honor. That's part of toxic masculinity. I mean, the culture of honor is, frankly, part of toxic masculinity. I wanted to say this for the end and sort of like let you come to it on your own, but we're talking about an experiment that is measuring toxic masculinity so well. And if you want to do research on toxic masculinity, we just need to find us the biggest person at Regis and have them walk down the hall in the middle and see how far they go before they bump, right? That would be, I mean, I think this is a great measure of toxic masculinity. And I think the word didn't exist back then, but this is one of the first studies on a culture of toxic masculinity. I'm sorry, killing somebody that insults you is toxic masculinity. I can understand how one can develop toxic masculinity behaviors themselves because I grew up in a situation that developed toxic masculinity in myself as a teenager. And I've been spending years to try to overcome it. But like this is the best measure of toxic masculinity that you will ever find. No questionnaire is going to assess what you want to assess better than this. This is like how fragile are you that you can't even let somebody pass you, right? I'm not saying the whole procedure, but just this measure. If you want to measure toxic masculinity, do this. And here's how you would do it. You'd put a video camera up, or you put a sensor on the floor, or you just record feet, and you have sort of markers on the floor that indicate, how many meters or feet have gone by. And that is a great measure of toxic masculinity right there. So, but then they measured how firmly they shook hands. So now I'm back to this. Sorry, I got a little off track. After all other dependent measures were collected, we gave the participant 2 questionnaires asking about traditional macho behaviors. For example, the inventories asked the participant how many push-ups he could do, how much alcohol he had ever drunk in one night, and how fast he had ever driven a car. Oh man, these are hilarious, but they're real. How many push-ups he could do? If I pushed myself, I could probably do a good 20. I'm not gonna lie, I'm not the age I used to be, but when I was their age, I would have said 150. Right when I was in college, right after coming out of the environment that taught me toxic masculinity, I would have definitely said 150. I would have probably went for 200. When I did it at school with the Air Force, I think I got to 90 and my arms fell out. So more likely 90, right? But like this was a big challenge with the Air Force recruiters at my high school. We kept trying to like see who was the strongest person. And I gotta give credit to my homeboy Nathan Nally for doing like 200 push-ups in a row, which was just really, really interesting. But that's my answer to there. How fast have I ever driven a car? Oh man, don't judge me, but 120 miles an hour. And then, and that's when I was younger. I would never do these things now. I put my life at risk, but yeah. And 120 miles an hour. Those old Lincolns really had a strong engine in them. And where was the other one? How much alcohol you ever drunk in one night? You are not going to get the answer to that from me right now, students. You will not. But like these are all interesting, measures of toxic masculinity. I don't care if they actually did it. It's about what they said. I still think the other one is the best. I think the walking in the hallway is the best, right? One of the questionnaires was private, but the other was public. As the participants believed he would have to discuss his answers with other experimental participants, we predicted that Southerners would answer the questions in a more macho way after the insult, whether it had been public or private, and that the effect would be stronger on the public questionnaire. I wonder if you're going to find that. Well, so number one, it's a questionnaire, so there's one other person reading it, so reputation exists. Eddie Harmon Jones, one of the best social psychologists currently alive, did this study with dissonance theory where folks were saying you needed to have like a public audience for cognitive dissonance to work. And he did this study where he literally had participants rip up their answers and throw it away into a trash can and then taped them together after they threw them away, right? Like had them throw it away in a garbage can, right? So the participant doesn't know he's going to pull it out, had him rip it up so nobody else could see it, right? And then showed that distance effects existed when they were truly private. I would like to apply truly private here because with one person, your reputation is always at risk. With one piece of the paper trail, your reputation is at risk. So I'd like to see that change. But ultimately, in this study of toxic masculinity following aggression of people who are from a culture of honor, they have amazing measures of toxic masculinity. We just didn't have the word back then. So I know a lot of you are interested in studying this. This is the way you study this. Finally, participants were asked to fill out an extensive questionnaire, blah, blah, blah. Let's see what happened. Let's talk about, we get an idea of what happened. We're putting it together. They had a lot of participants, 148 white male undergraduates. That's a real study. That's a good sample size. 88 Northern, 60 Southern. Would like to see it more 70-70, but still a pretty good sample size. They were recruited and paid $15. Ooh, they get more money now. Ooh, fancy. I'm guessing they ran through their pool pretty quick, or they got a grant. Southerners were defined as anyone who had lived at least 6 years in the South. Other we're done. The experimenter told the participants that the experiment concerned people's personality and the contributions of nature versus nurture to personality. Oh my God, these are great. These are awesome because they're not lying. This is nature versus nurture, right? Like, but they're not telling them exactly what they want. These are cover stories. This is what you need to run a real study. The participants can't know what your hypothesis is. Quit telling your participants the hypothesis. You're not going to get data you can trust. Those of you that are majors and are gonna take research methods, let some of these words stick in. You're reading good papers now, but they're not perfect, right? Like how do you give a good cover story? Do this. Don't not give a cover story. She explained that participants would fill out a few personality inventories, answer some demographic questions, and provide a saliva sample that could be assayed for biological properties. She gave participants a demographic questionnaire as well, has another filler questionnaire, and had them provide a saliva sample as an experiment too. The saliva samples were in fact not assayed later. They didn't assayed later. They didn't have the money to do so. They were collected to give credibility to the nature versus nurture cover story. Lies. I don't believe it. I'm sorry. I love Nisbet. I love these authors. I love Cohen. Like, they're some of my favorite, but these are lies. I don't care, and they're gonna hate that I'm calling them a liar, but they don't know me. I'm a nobody. It doesn't matter. But like, these are lies. There's no way. No way. That's BS. Okay, they were collected to give. No, I'm whatever. After the participant provided the saliva sample, which they didn't use, the experimenter sent him down the hall to be bumped publicly, privately, or not at all. When the participant reached a specified point in the hall, he was either bumped or not. A few seconds later, a Confederate, so they get bumped. A Confederate covertly signaled the chicken Confederate to appear. So now you got one bumper. Like, there's so many actors in this. So first things first. Bumped. Publicly or privately. Bumped. Okay? A few seconds later, the lineman is signaled. Walkie-talkie style, probably. The chicken Confederate walked toward the participant and estimated the distance in inches at which the participant gave way to him. Don't like the measure there. Don't like the measure. You could record how many inches away two people are from each other. Even in the 90s, all right? We had handy cams. You could record that. He also rated the participant's appearance for how amused, threatening, angry, and so on he looked. In trial runs, the chicken's estimate of distance correlated more than 0.9 with actual. Oh, they got actual distance. Great. I'm cool with it. We're good. The chicken, the observers, and the evaluator were, of course, aware of the condition, but did not know whether participants were Southern or Northern. I guess there's a no. Oh, there's a bumped condition, so they know the bump condition. They have to, right? Okay. When the participant returned to the room, the experimenter said that why does it matter if they know? Well, if they know the conditions, experimental bias plays in. There's a great study by, it's either Rosenhan or Rosenberg. Let me find this out. Rosenhan psychology, bloomers. Let me see here. I think no. So the Rosenhan study is another interesting one. It's the Rosenthal experiment. So Rosenhan and Rosenthal, and I don't know where Rosenberg came from in my mind, but they're all three similar names. But these are two amazing experiments. So the Rosenhan experiment, I'll just give you a quick on it. They took famous psychologists like Leon Festinger, like all these just amazing psychologists got together, decided to present that they were hearing voices, and they went to a psychiatric hospital, and they quit presenting immediately and told everybody they were fine and acted fine. They weren't released from the hospital for like 2 weeks to a month. So that's a great study. And then the Rosenthal experiment, which is amazing. They took actual teachers, gave their kids a bogus IQ test, and told them that half their students were either bloomers or not. Bloomers are students that will bloom in that that current year. And what they found was that the teachers put more effort into the bloomers, and the bloomers actually developed more intelligence by the end of the semester. So like the students, the expectations, and they did it with students, and there's another one with mice as well. I forget who did the mice one. I think it is Rosenthal as well. But they did one with mice where participants rated, were told that the mice were smart or dumb, and well, not the participants, the grad students were told that mice were smart or dumb, and they treated the smart mice better and actually ran the maze faster, supposedly. But what it was the experimenter who had the stopwatch stopping when the mouse's nose crossed the line versus when the tail crossed the line. It's things like that. So like experimenter expectations can affect how you observe the data. And so that's important for the linemen. And they affect how others respond. They expect how you treat others, and it affects how others respond to your treatment. The way you treat others impacts their behavior. So like these are all sort of interesting studies. You can actually, just by simply believing that a student's smarter, they can actually become smarter. I'm not really sorry for the tangent there, but these are all important questions. So let's get back to where we were. That's why I was okay with the actual distance being there. The chicken, the observers, and the evaluator were, of course, aware of the condition, but did not know whether the participants were from the south or from the north. Okay, we're almost there. When the participant returned to the room, the experimenter said that the experiment concerned who you are, and that one big part of who we are is who other people think we are. She explained the importance of first impressions for this and said that sometimes people are aware of the first impressions they make, and sometimes they are not. She explained that the participant would have a brief meeting with another participant, actually the evaluator confederate, not the big, not the big person in the hallway. She added that the participant's task would be, so this is the person who was observing everything. She added that the participant's task would be to guess what this other person really thought of him. The participant and his counterpart would be allowed to shake hands, but that was all. She said that no talking was allowed. Oh, holy, that's there's so many cool measures in here. Cohen, Nisbet, Bodwell, and Schwarz did an amazing job with this paper. I keep, like, every time I read it, I find stuff that I could take into there. This first impression questionnaire, not questionnaire, but this measure is really cool. And let me make sure I got the evaluator right. Yeah, because there's the bump. I think we got that right. We'll find out in a second. The experimenter explained that pairs of people would be meeting like this all semester. She added that to encourage as much accuracy and honesty as possible, the participant in the experiment who came closest to guessing what the other person thought of him would win $100. Motivation to take it seriously. The experimenter then look at all these amazing steps. This is seriously top-notch experimental design with a few flaws. Okay. The experimenter then brought in the evaluator confederate who shook hands with the participant. In the public bump condition, the evaluator was one of the witnesses to the bump. In the private condition, there had been no witnesses at all. In the control condition, there was, of course, no bump to observe. After the brief handshake between the participant and the evaluator, the experimenter sent the evaluator out into the hall to record his impressions. Back in the experimental room, the experimenter explained that the participant would now have to guess what the evaluator thought of him. On a 1 to 5 scale, the participant guessed what the other person thought of him on dimensions such as cowardly, courageous, strong, weak, and manly, not manly, as well as filler dimensions such as introverted, extroverted, attractive, unattractive, and so on. Well, I'm clearly the most attractive person in the world, so that's what I'm marking on that one. A little humor, a little levity. After the participant completed these items, the experimenter asked him to rate himself on these dimensions as he really was. She explained that this was not for the $100 prize, but would merely help the research project. She then gave the participant the first personality questionnaire with the masculine protest items. Protest, pre-test, post-test. I'm guessing that's what they mean there. It's a weird word. I haven't seen it before in this method. After the participant was finished, she gave him the second personality questionnaire with another set of masculine protest items. She explained that the second questionnaire was relatively new and so would be the focus of a discussion between the participant and a few other undergraduate men. Genius method here. 2 questionnaires, basically the same, probably different items. But one was done that would not be talked about, the other one would be talked about. After the participant completed the second masculine protest questionnaire and then another demographic questionnaire, he was debriefed and reconciled with the bumper and probably got their autograph. It is fun. Like I taught at University of Wisconsin-Madison, it is fun to know athletes who end up becoming pro athletes. I know one, Kevin Zeitler, who's the starting right guard for the Browns, who I taught stats to. But it's fun to meet them and get to know them. They're kind of like heroes on campus. And I didn't really care. Like when I was on campus, Kevin was just a kid in my class who worked really hard. But like, being able to say I taught like the highest paid lineman in the NFL is a pretty cool thing. So they probably got an autograph there. But I just want you to see like how this study brings in the culture of University of Michigan, right? It's a Big Ten school. Football's huge, right? They're looking at like, it's a big party school. They're looking at people that come there from the South and the North to party. These are the out-of-state kids, like they're looking at differences in culture, but they're bringing them into, they used all the aspects of University of Michigan that, you don't have at Regis. This measure we could do at Regis, but I don't know if we can find the level of size of a person that they had, in the O-line at the University of Michigan in 1996 when they were like world champions multiple times. Okay. Sorry, little sports nerd here. Okay. I'll get back to it. Once again, the public versus private nature of the insult was not an important factor in participants' responses to the insult because it's not private, right? But this also tells you why wouldn't they change the method? They already know this because they ran them all at the same time. They had multiple, I guarantee, like Bodel had one, Schwartz had one, Nisbet had one, right? They all had one. And they all ran one study at the same time. That's my guess. It's important to let readers know that so other scientists know how these studies work. So I'm reading a little bit of Harking into this study right now. Yeah, I'm done with that. All right, let's read our results for this very interesting study. And there's nothing new here. Public versus private didn't matter because what they're calling private is actually a one-on-one reputation threat condition. So we're just not gonna we're not gonna worry about that. We're gonna focus on the chicken game. Has maybe seen in Figure 3, the insult dramatically changed the behavior of Southerners in the chicken game. Insulted Southerners went much farther before chickening out and deferring to the Confederate. 37 inches for insulted Southerners, so 3 feet before they got out of the big lineman's way, compared with control Southerners who were like 10 feet away, 108 inches. So, yeah, it's like 10 feet. The insult did not much affect the behavior of Northerners. They used those same contrasts as they did before, even though in this case, the 2x2 ANOVA would work out. But because they used this contrast analysis in the previous work, they got to use it again. And essentially, we can ignore that last sentence. They found a really interesting finding here. Like, you're probably like saying, why does this matter? Because when Southerners are, their honor is threatened, they actually more likely to put their own lives in danger, because you could get harmed by walking into a very large future NFL player, right? Like that's not going to be perfect. Now let's go ahead and look at these graphs just for a second to figure out what's going on. Evaluators' ratings of subjects' dominance versus submission. That's Figure 5. Let's see what this one is. This is Figure 4, firmness of handshake. I want to see if there's a Figure 3. anywhere near us. Ah, this is perfect right here. So, remember, less distance is closer to the huge guy. And what you see is the main result of this study, and it's where I'm going to end. I'm going to zoom out a little bit. And there, now we can see the whole thing. When Southern subjects are insulted, they walk right up to this big, huge guy walking down the middle of that corridor till about 3 feet. When they see him, they recognize how big he is and that they're not going to win this battle. Okay? But when they're in the control condition, they give him 10 feet. You can see that up there. One of the things I want to point out is that while the South has a culture of honor, it also has a culture of hospitality. And these two things seem at odds, right? Like, how can you be hospitable to strangers, but also protect your honor from any threats? Well, you have a switch, a mean switch, that when your honor's threatened, you turn it on. You're ready to fight, kill, murder, all that stuff. But when it's off, you're more polite, you're you're in this case, more polite would be, for me, allowing this person to have that 10 feet, allowing them to walk first. That's what I think's going on there. And I think you can really see that. And now you get to see how complicated culture is. These kids, because these are, to my perspective, y'all are kids, and I don't mean it in a disrespectful way. You're just very, very young adults. So, like, your behaviors and stuff are driven by a lot of not choice, right? It's kind of going along with what folks tell you to do and doing what society says is best for your future and trying to find your way in the world, right? So during this period where we have these young 18 and 19-year-olds trying to find their way, we can sort of see what's happening here, right? Like they're sweet. They're sweet in the control condition. They're nice and they're friendly. They're more nice than Northerners. And then in the insult condition, they become ready to fight, ready to murder. That, like, one little attack to them in the world drastically changes their biological response, drastically changes their behavior, drastically changes who they are. I'm going to actually argue that even if it's the same person, the person here is a different person than the person here. And for Northern subjects, when they're insulted, they're less likely to move out of the way too. Their masculinity's been insulted, but this is a measure of toxic masculinity, like I said before. And I think it's a really important thing to look at. Like, oh wow, this cultural thing, just simply being insulted, can lead one to put their life at risk, to be mean. And not just one, lead a person who's a sweetheart, that gives you all this space up here, is ready to fight, is ready to, comes within 3 feet of you, sees how big you are, and ducks out of the way, right? And there were some participants that walked right into this guy. That's a fact. There were some that walked right into this guy. So for this section, we're just going to look at all the graphs that they give us, because we can understand the whole section by looking at the graphs. Evaluators' ratings of subject's dominance versus submission. So these are the evaluator, that outside person. Sorry about that. That outside person looking at their work and looking at their demeanor, sorry. What you see is that, in the control condition, the Southerners are sweethearts again. More sweethearts than the Northerners. But you flip that switch, you insult them, and they're ready to dominate. They're ready to reassert their dominance. Chill. Non-dominance means go with the flow, right? To the point of, I want to be in control. I want to dominate you. I want power. Northern subjects also want a little bit more power after the insult. But, I think it's interesting that the Southern men, the white Southern men, go from being sweethearts to being complete abject meanies, right? Jerks. How can they be the same person? Because it's not them. It's the culture that's driving this behavior. It's the culture of living down there for 20 years that made folks learn two appropriate responses under two different conditions. They learn to be polite and hospitable when everything's okay. But when it's not okay, they get down. They're ready to go. They're ready to dominate, right? And, this is one of the cores of toxic masculinity. Now let's go ahead and look at the rating of handshakes. What do you got here? You got nice light handshakes to very strong and grippy handshakes. Sweethearts, the sweetest of sweethearts in the study, to the meanest of mean. Like, have you ever had that handshake that makes your knuckles kind of go over each other? Like to me, that's a painful situation. The northern subjects, on the other hand, they go down after the insult a little bit, but probably not significantly. So now we're just seeing like all these behavioral attributes being affected by this cultural manipulation, but you're also understanding how the South can be the place of hospitality and the place of historic violence, both racial violence and non-racial violence. I mean, the South is a violent place, but it's also a hospitable place. I don't know if anybody's ever driven through the South. I remember when I was a little kid, we went on a trip to Disney World, and we drove our station wagon from Indiana down to Florida. And I just remember, like, all the folks that I interacted with were super nice and sweet to me as like a little punk 13-year-old kid that thought, I wasn't that little, but I was, still a punk 13, 12-year-old kid, think I'm too cool to be with my parents, right? Like, but everybody was super nice. But also I just remember thinking, like, this is where the Klan is. This is where they allowed slavery, right? Like, how do you have both of these, not only allowed, but like encouraged it? Still, I swear, still want it to this day if you look at the signs that they show in their yards and their Confederate flags and all that, right? Like, how can you have both? Because your culture prepares you to be both ways. What I'm learning here isn't that these people are assholes. No, on the contrary. I'm learning that they can be sweethearts or they can be assholes. And I think that's important to understand. We often think the person's in complete control of their behavior. But if this person was always a certain way, right, they would always give a hard handshake. They would always do that. They would always try to bump you out of the way. But they go from being sweethearts to assholes. This is about the training of an individual through their culture. Not necessarily, the creating of bad people, but creating of people that act bad ways in specific situations. Because culture needs you to act friendly and nice to folks who are part of the dominant group. But it needs you to protect your honor, to protect yourself in this world. So the humans are just adapting in the ways that their culture is patterned in them. And I think that is interesting. And we're still kind of asking the question, why? And I think this image right here allows us to understand why. What's going on here. And do you remember that question that said, how masculine do they think the other person thinks they are, that evaluator, right? In the control group, no difference there. They believe that the experimenter views them highly masculine. However, after they've been insulted, called an asshole in public, they actually are perceiving others as viewing them as not being masculine. We got to understand, is masculinity a core part of the Southern male culture? Yes, it is. Is it probably a core part of these folks' identity? Yes, it is. Is it a core part of their self-concept, being a man? Yes, it is. What you're seeing here is the way to measure self-esteem in men that are too proud to admit that their self-esteem has been reduced. I guarantee if we gave a self-esteem questionnaire to these folks right now, they'd all give us booming high, ratings on self-esteem. But when you ask them how manly somebody else views them, that's when you understand how hurt they are. Because I'm not saying this is a good way to evaluate yourself, right? But at the same time, they didn't choose to evaluate themselves this way. This is how their culture decided to define them and their self-esteem. So their core value of masculinity is dropping. They're going into a world and they're like, I'm a masculine person, but nobody's viewing me as masculine, right? And this might not seem like a big deal, but replace masculine with your core value, right? Smart. Have you ever had a teacher not think you're smart and you know you're smart? Right? I know students go through this all the time. And it's a big struggle, right? For these Southern men, they are expressing their drop in self-esteem through this questionnaire. They feel less than they did before this happens. They feel like less of a person, like they're not living up their values. And I think this is really important for us to understand what's going on here, right? It's really important for us to not just demonize people, but it is important for us to start demonizing cultures a little bit, right? If you're an 18-year-old young person that grew up in the South or grew up in a culture of honor and you had to learn how to survive, and now you learned what it meant to be grown up, an adult, and mature. That meant masculine, right? But you learned all these ways to survive. And now you're exhibiting those ways in an experiment. Is it your fault, or is it the situation you had to survive's fault? Is it the culture? Is it the ideas behind it? Right? The stuff from history that we didn't set up. And so a lot of the times it's very easy to view people as good or bad. But here, I think with this finding right here, it points out to us, if we really think about it, yes, it's toxic masculinity, but also, how do we balance that with the fact that we know this is important to these individuals, that it's probably the core of their identity, and that they've just been brought down to a low point on their core of their identity. Right? It's the culture that allowed this to happen. It's having, these participants had grandfathers who were allowed to murder people if they told them they were going to murder them if they didn't take back an insult. Right? Think about living in that. Think about the environment you lived in. Maybe it's similar, but likely it's not. Right? Think about that. The stuff that you learn, that you pass down, that you share, right? But also that you didn't create. It just formed and shaped you. And now you have these values that I personally disagree with toxic masculinity. I think it's bad. But also, how did it develop? If we really want to attack it, do you think we're going to be successful calling these young people bad? Or do you think we're going to be successful in realizing, oh my, growing up in a bad, toxically masculine culture of honor, makes you into an individual that goes from being a nice person in most of these data points to being a complete jerk. So is the person a complete jerk or a nice person? I don't know. But I can tell you this behavior was patterned out of their society. And so the goal here, if we want to get rid of toxic masculinity, is we have to repattern our society. And what does that mean? That means our newscasts don't talk about these intermale murders in the South that happened for somebody dating someone's girlfriend and talking about it like it was justified, right? That's not justified. We need to look down on these acts of violence as a society. So if we want to change Southern society, We have to change Southern media, Southern social norms, right? We have to change. If we change the laws, that's a good first step, and they did. They did in more recent times, but still, it's the application of the laws. It's the open discussion of the disgust of the acceptable behavior, but not necessarily looking at the individuals who are subjected to a pattern of culture that completely impacted the way they think and behave, which is what this series of studies shows, and blame them. Because if you really want to get rid of toxic masculinity, blame is not the answer. It's structural and social change. And in the case of the South, right, it might be something like putting out a feminist blog or a feminist newspaper or a feminist TV show on the Nashville network, right? Like hitting that culture where its culture is spreading out its viruses, which is through media, and that one's kind of easy to change if we had money. We start our own TV show, we make that happen, right? We talk about this stuff openly, we have these conversations when we're asked. But at the same time, right, as psychologists, we know that these people aren't in control. We know that we're not in control of our behaviors either. And so we have to develop some empathy for the people we're studying, because we don't want to just sit here on our high horse and feel better than these folks because maybe we don't act this way. Or maybe you don't act this way, right? I described that I think I grew up in a culture of honor when I was younger. We need to change the cultural structures. We need to actively fight them in order to change them. And there are a few ways through this, right? Changing the laws, making the laws, right? You can think of professions that allow that. Being in media, like Atlanta has a very heavy media scene right now. Are people, are those shows permeating Southern culture? Right? It's like the show Atlanta permeating Southern culture. Is the show Atlanta even not toxically masculine, right? There is some toxic masculinity in that show. How do we make a show that makes it to the South, that changes this culture? How do we make laws that don't allow people to murder anybody? How do we make curriculum in elementary school that specifically tackles this? Well, first we need lawmakers to allow us to do it, and then we need education specialists to make it happen. My advice to folks that are wanting to make social change is don't view the people as the cause of the problem. The people are just doing what people have always done, adapting to their environment and learning how to survive. It's the culture that we're trying to change. It's the culture that we need to change. And if we don't, we're going to continue having toxic masculine presidential candidates, in this case, both of them, that get away with raping women and then become the leaders of our nation. How do we stop this from happening? How do we stop electability being associated with toxically masculine behaviors in the South? Right? We can even see the connection. They're comforted by somebody who's willing to take up any acts of aggression against the South with violence, because that's what they believe is the appropriate response that will protect them. How do we change that belief? Right? I mean, I think if you look at the current Democratic primary, we're seeing that folks wanted a candidate who gets out there and tells Trump he's going to kick his ass, right? That's what Biden did. They look at a candidate that has allegations of sexual assault against them, and for me, when I hear that, I'm like, they definitely assaulted them. That's kind of like my response here. And they hear that and they're not affected by that, right? Because it's all connected to the same cultural milieu that creates these problems in the first place. And this milieu is present even a little bit in our northern men. You can see that as well, right? And insult makes them feel a little less masculine as well. Don't ignore that little line. We need more participants to show that as significant, but I'll guarantee it's there. So our question when trying to understand toxic masculinity, which is probably the lens a lot of us want to view this article with, do we blame the people? Do we think we're going to be successful there? Or do we start to change the practices of the media, the norms, the criticism? And guess what? That's going to be damn near impossible since our media has fractured in the last 10 years. When we had only 3 major networks and everybody watched the same news, we were all on the same page. And all we had to do was get our story on the news, and we could change opinions in one night. But today, the way it works, we're fractured. We don't have a shared common reality anymore. And without that shared common reality, we're not going to be able to understand each other. But ultimately, the question I want you to think about is, if you were raised in the South, would you view this behavior as wrong? Or would you engage in this behavior? If you grew up in a place where toxic masculinity was required for survival, like I did when I was younger, would you engage in it? Would you be in control of your actions? Would you be in control of your anger and aggression response? Do we think this is done on purpose? If we asked these participants, would they even know that they were being toxically masculine? No, they wouldn't. So in many ways, these folks are like a lot of humans. We get eaten up by our culture. We become part of it. We might, we like a few things about it. In this case, maybe the hospitality aspect of the Southern culture. But then we're buying into the violence and the racial violence of the South. Are they really to blame? I mean, it depends on if they know or if they don't, right? Are these young kids to blame? No, they're not. These participants are not. But after they learn about this, they are. So keep that in mind too. But ultimately, those of us that want to change toxic masculinity, we're not going to do it by yelling at people and blaming people for being toxically masculine. The more effective method is to change cultural structures by either running for legislation, running a media company, developing art. One of the interesting things about being a cultural psychologist is that you start to appreciate that things like art and media actually can change the world. And so with that in mind, right, I really want you to not approach this in the way that these people are bad people. You're a psychologist. Your first duty as a psychologist is to assume that people are people, not people are evil. If somebody has antisocial personality disorder, which means they often end up in jails and they do violent acts, and sometimes we call people like this psychopaths, sometimes we call them sociopaths, right? But we have to recognize that these are people that we are meant to help, that we are meant to help live a better life. The sad thing is that, these toxically masculine behaviors are impacting the lives of women all over this country. And trans individuals all over this country. That's hard to swallow. But I think it's even harder to swallow the idea that these behaviors are driven not by individual preference, but by cultural practices and patterns. So what are we to do? We need to actively start getting into positions, careers, that allow us to directly fight these things. Sometimes that's raising your voice, I get that, but sometimes it's being a little bit more Machiavellian. We are fighting an entity that most people don't even know we're fighting it. Culture. People can create culture, but they don't create the culture that creates them. Their culture creates them. They don't create the culture that creates them. They create the culture that creates the next generation. So we need to change the culture for the next generation. We need to do it effectively, and we need to realize our enemy is culture, not people. Our goal is all people living harmoniously and with respect for each other. It's not getting rid of or canceling people that don't agree with us. So we need to really, really, really think about our actions now following this class, right? You should speak up if somebody says something in class. But also, you should also realize that speaking up won't change who they are on the inside. You got to change who they are on the inside by changing what they experienced for the first 20 years of their life, or for the last 20, or for the next 20 years, or the last 20 years. That's the power that culture has. It can make you a different person in a given situation. You're an insult here? Yeah. You have a relatively high, toxically masculine self-esteem, because I think that's what this is. Self-esteem for people with toxic masculinity. But if you are insulted, your toxically masculine self-esteem gets dropped so far down enough that it hurts you. And through that hurt, you will engage in a pattern of behavior, like trying to run this dude over, that will perpetuate not your lifespan or your goals, but the goals of your culture, which for some reason has decided to place men in a more powerful role than women, right? And those are questions to think about. And then they got some other variables, but I think we're there. I know in other studies they kind of talked about how, like, here, let's read the discussion. The results of Experiment 3 indicate that Southerners who were insulted in front of others saw themselves as diminished in masculine reputation and status, which is their version of self-esteem. Perhaps particularly as a result, the insult produced more aggressive and domineering behavior. Maybe more likely as the culture, but these folks know that. Although uninsulted Southerners were, look at that, they were sweethearts. More polite than other Northerners, insulted Southerners were much more aggressive than any other group. The increased aggressiveness and the desire of insulted Southern participants to reestablish themselves was demonstrated in the direct challenge situation of the chicken game with the huge person. Insulted Southerners went much farther in the chicken game than did control Southerners, whereas Northerners were unaffected by the insult. Furthermore, the effect of the insult on Southerners was demonstrated more subtly in the interpersonal encounter with the evaluator. Insulted Southerners were much more domineering towards the evaluator than were control Southerners, whereas Northerners were again unaffected. The increased aggressive and dominance behavior of insulted Southerners in Experiment 3 is consistent with the cognitive and physiological preparation for aggression and competition found in Experiments 1 and 2. All of their psychology is primed to fulfill this cultural idea, all of it. Their physiology, their behaviors, their thoughts. And the one thing I want to point out about physiology is it's hidden, right? This is a great mechanism for culture to control you without you realizing it. You're not a biological internal detector. Right now, you can't tell me your stress level. I mean, you can tell me to some degree, but, you're not going to view it as a biological response. You're not going to be able to tell me your cortisol levels, your levels of blood glucose, anything like that. You're not going to know. That's why we go to doctors and we have tools that measure that, right? So a lot of this stuff often goes undetected. One might be a little grumpy, but they don't recognize it. They don't know that their biology changed to make them more irritable. This is a very effective means for culture to put its viruses in you. If you experience culture and then it can take control of your biological responses, then it can control you without awareness. The biological responses might be the interface between the cultural desires and getting us to do what culture wants. And then it changes our behavior and our cognitions and all of that. The findings of the present experiment are consistent with survey and archival data showing that the South possesses a version of the culture of honor. Southerners and Northerners who were not insulted were indistinguishable on most measures, with the exception that control Southerners appeared somewhat more polite and deferential on behavioral measures than did control Northerners. However, insult dramatically changed this picture. After the affront, Southern participants differed from Northern participants in several important cognitive, emotional, physiological, and behavioral respects. You know what? I'm going to leave this one up for you. If you want to see what they have to think, that you can read this discussion. But for me, I'm done. I get it. And I'm thinking about the culture, human interface. I'm thinking about how do we change toxic masculinity in our world? And how do we start to do that? It's not through blaming the individuals who engage in that. Because here's the analogy. There's a factory. It's called culture. It's pushing out people who are toxically masculine. You interact with one of these people and you try to change them. Maybe you're effective, maybe you're not. And then you just, and this factory is putting out, 10 people an hour. And you're able to talk to one a day. And you're just going in trying to change each one individually. Why not just take the gears of the factory out, right? Because it's hard. It has security. People are protecting it, right? But if you want to be effective, you have to change culture. You don't necessarily have to change people. Because if you change culture, people will change. Now, here's my thing. I think about cancel culture that we currently have right now, where, even right now, you've been reading the posts, don't do this. Like I've heard so many different conflicting points about what to do with coronavirus to be a morally good human being that it's kind of frustrating. I've seen people call out other people for going to the store and endangering others. I've seen people call out people for not going to the store and, not supporting a worker strike. I've seen people get called out for even buying stuff from the grocery store. And then I've seen people get called out for even for even ordering stuff from restaurants. Right? Because those people should be able to be at home and be safe too. But you know what we don't call out very often? The cultural processes that lead to these problems. Right? What cultural processes are breaking down right now? Well, right now our media system is completely messed up to where nobody knows what's going on. That's one cultural process. Another cultural process is that our government is more worried about political gains than people's lives. You can see that in the Supreme Court's decision in Wisconsin that they ironically held from a closed-door meeting where they all video conferenced in and were separated from each other. Our culture is also broke in the fact that presidential candidates, both of them now, Biden and Trump, have records of sexual assault. Yeah. I'm not a lawyer here. They have records of committing sexual assault. Based on the data, that's what you're going to see. Right? Until we stop. And then we got to say, well, how did that happen? Well, if you look at Super Tuesday, who won the South? The guy on the Democratic Party that actively engages in physical violence threats against President Trump. Doesn't that make sense now? How do we start changing the culture? Maybe it is the shame thing. Maybe the shame cancel culture thing is working. Maybe it is. But my guess is it probably has a lot of backfiring, because you got people that are of different levels of toxic masculinity, that they're like, oh, at least they're like, well, I haven't raped anyone, so I'm not as toxic as them, right? Like, oh, that person's getting called out, I'm not. They're the bad person, I'm the good one. Until we attack the culture, we're not going to have the change we want. And by attacking the individuals, I don't know if that's going to be effective. That's an empirical question that's up for debate right now. It could be the process of cultural change. It very much could be. Or it could be the process of stagnation and actually like allowing other people to feel that they're not as bad as some of the, and I've heard this too, like, oh, well, you know, like, oh, I'm not as bad as Harvey Weinstein. That guy's really sexist. That's real sexism, right? So we got to be careful about what images we're putting out there. Like, our image of sexism now is a chronic rapist who is one of the most awful people in the world. And now other people are like, I'm not as bad as him, right? We need to attack culture, toxic masculinity at those lower levels, at those more moderate versions of toxic masculinity. But how do we do it effectively? Is canceling one person, that is canceling, like, not a famous person, but like canceling people on Twitter, is that the way to do it? Maybe. I think there are empirical questions there. I think there's some general change in our culture, but I also have not experienced life in the culture of honor that I grew up in a very long time. I don't know how those folks respond to things that I see in the Twitter sphere or in Facebook that like might change my behavior or might make me think twice about this act of toxic masculinity that I may engage in. But is this leading to change in the areas that are the factories of toxic masculinity production? I don't know. It's an empirical question, but it's one that you're going to have to deal with. If we are getting our education to change this world, which we should be, is it canceling people, or through a little bit of empathy, right? We can understand how painful this is. And then we can understand, I gotta go up one more, I think. Yep. Then we can understand how this person goes from being the sweetest of sweethearts to being the most vicious of cruel. What's the best way to change the world? You gotta shut the factory down, y'all. And that means you gotta get elected. You gotta start making media. You gotta start making media that, you know, folks on the other side see, or we're just going to keep creating two different cultures that aren't working together right now. And by two different cultures, I mean liberal and conservative ideologies, right? How do we bridge those gaps? Yes, I've seen drastic change in the Twitter sphere on the liberal side, but I worry that on the conservative side, we've seen a drastic rebound effect in the other direction. We need to get control of our laws, our media, our education, anything, any cultural institution like that. Our economics, which I think is impossible right now, right? But our economics, if one didn't have to worry, like, imagine this world where if somebody stole your sheep, it wasn't your problem. It was an economic problem shared by your entire community, and your entire community was behind you in finding the person who stole your sheep. Imagine if you somebody stole your sheep, you could still eat, right? Where would we have this death murder response that that Cohen and all are trying to investigate? It's a good question to think about, but also it's a good thing to think about where's your education going to lead you? Where do you want to find yourself in 10 years to where you're changing toxic masculinity, changing the culture? Do you just want to find your place inside this system, and as messed up as it is? Or do you want to start helping to construct a system that works? That's a question you're going to have to answer. The easy answer is to just keep going along and doing what society tells you to do and getting the monetary rewards that let you buy stuff that don't bring you happiness. The harder answer is figuring out the best way you can change something like this, shut down this cultural factory, and make a difference. Is it this armchair twittering? Maybe to some degree, but I don't think that's going to be the answer to make real change. And part of that too, I want to say, if you cringe at me bringing up empathy for these young 18-year-old participants, what does that say about your own psychology, about how that has been constructed by your cultural views, right? Right? If we aim to bring our worlds together and to end things like toxic masculinity and racism, do we want to do it through a war where people die? Or do we want to do it by creating the kind of culture that creates good people? Because right now we don't live in a culture that protects us. We don't live in a culture that creates good people. And all this will pass right now. All this will pass. There are consequences of what's going on right now. But for your future, you have a decision to make. And it's a tough one. And it's one that I don't know if I know what I've made now. Let me tell you the decision. You got to decide to just do what society tells you and get the rewards that our society will give you. Or you got to fight that battle and try to get control of some aspect of culture that can make a difference. That might be as simple as developing a talk show. Well, not as simple. That might be developing a talk show that's seen by everyone in the South, that doesn't just come out and, like, if you wanted it to work right now, a show that was just like, you all are toxically masculine would not work. But maybe some pieces about people's lives that have been ruined by responding with this response right here would be a good way to start. The consequences of honor violence, right? A whole documentary series on that. That might actually change people, because people do have empathy for each other. It gets trained out of us. So yes, I disagree with a lot of the values of the people that are studied in this article, but I also respect them as humans. And I understand, because I grew up in a very similar situation, how these behaviors can be built and constructed without your conscious awareness and without your conscious desire. But the only thing you're doing consciously is trying to survive. And so that's a choice that you all have to make, that I made when I was your age, to not engage in the traditional, as much as I could, to not engage in the traditional economic system, right? I could have went out and became a financial planner that just made money. That was on the table for me when I graduated. I decided to explore a little bit more and try to do something a little bit more humane, right? But a lot of my students, I think they don't understand when we butt heads. We butt heads over the fact that you're going to miss out on this knowledge and making an actual choice for yourself. That's why this class and me didn't get along so well at the beginning, right? Because inside this class are amazing ideas and amazing choices for you to make. But it's real. This is a real thing. Do you want to live in this world anymore, or do you want to change it? Well, do you think maybe the morals that you're hearing about how to change it might be a little messed up every once in a while, if you're viewing these young people that are your age that frankly haven't been through college yet, the first place where we teach you this stuff, to know better, right? We're going to view them and ostracize them. We can't do that. We need to develop the biggest, most fair most friendly social group for us to truly thrive. And this probably goes for all of our other concerns as well. Like whenever we have a social structure that breaks a human, right? We're going to have to choose and figure out the best way to break that structure. People have been trying to end racism for years by changing people's hearts and minds, but they haven't changed the prison industrial complex very much up until the last couple of years, right? How do we change the prison industrial complex? For some of us, if we're strong enough, that might mean joining it. I'm not saying I would ever do that. I'm not strong enough. But it might mean joining it. It might mean becoming the mayor of this town and controlling it. It might mean becoming a state senator and making the rules and making it illegal to engage in those activities. But ultimately, we can't view other humans as our enemies. We just can't. We need to start putting our frustration where it belongs, onto the amorphous concept of culture that has been shaping us and making us do things against our own benefits and against the lives of others for far too long. This needs to stop. How are you going to stop it? Right? And those decisions aren't always easy to make. How are you going to stop it? And honestly, this might mean make as much money as possible, get as much power and influence as possible, and use that to make a difference, because that appears to be step number one in American politics and power. If you make $10 billion a year, I will not judge you. But if you use your money to support these unjust systems, I will judge you. But if you use that money to tear them down and tear down your own power, that's the kind of person we need. So those are my thoughts, but think about why we butted heads. I wanted you to think and talk and engage, and we wouldn't. We were worried about getting our paper to join the system that's producing toxically masculine people, that's producing racist people, that's producing hate towards people that are subject to cultural influences, right? That's why we butted heads. And I will continue to butt heads with students that view the world that way, because that's not what Regis is about. Regis is not about just going with the status quo and getting your paper and entering the society and leaving it the way it is. Regis is about making a just world. So, how are you going to do that? Shaming people on Twitter? Or doing something that's a little bit more productive? Maybe even, you know what? One thing that people don't view, become an elementary school teacher. I had elementary school teachers in Indiana that taught me about empathy, racial equality, and I remember these lessons in 3rd grade and 2nd grade and 4th grade. They made an impact on me, right? If we had teachers doing that in every single school across the nation, what could we accomplish? Right? In order to do that, what do we have to do? One of us has to get control of the education system at the top, at the government range, in the state that we're in. These are realities of how we make change. Blaming other people and ostracizing them as bad is not how you're going to make change. These students right here that go from sweethearts to just jerks, their entire self-concept has just been blown the frack apart. And while you don't agree with their value system, you know what it's like to have your value system blown the frack apart. It's social justice is more than just slogans, and it's more than just individual behavior. It's thoughtful consideration of how you're going to impact the world.